Morning. Welcome to the Board of Pharmacy meeting. We, just as a little bit of housekeeping, the restrooms are right outside the door in the lobby. We'll start out by call to order. Do you want to start us out, Ricardo?
Sure. Ricardo Sanchez, public member.
Lavanza Butler, professional member.
Debbie Veal, professional member.
Amy Gutierrez, professional member.
Victor Law, professional member.
Stan Weiser, professional member.
Alan Shad, professional member.
Albert Wong, professional member.
Okay, we'll start off by public comments for items not on the agenda or agenda items for future meetings. Is there any public comments? Please come up. I believe those speakers are on. The microphones are on. Good morning.
Hi, Dr. Pam, Alameda County pharmacist, a pharmacist owner, United Pharmacy in Berkeley, California. I wanted to state that we had a visit from your board, and as a result, we found a lot more about fraudulent prescriptions than we ever thought we would know. I passed this information along to many of the pharmacists in the Alameda County area, ended up buying black flashlights and starting a continuing inventory for the class 3s through 4s along with the class 2s. I thought that maybe the board might consider coming into Alameda County with their program that they have. They've been to San Jose, they go up to Sacramento, but there's quite a few pharmacists in Alameda County also that could use the that education.
Are you talking about the DEA
That's right,
prescription,
We-
the training that we
That's
do?
right,
We are having one in the UCSF this month, 27.
Okay, you get
Yeah.
it's in San Francisco. Everything's on a Saturday. Why?
Well,
Okay. Oh no, I work Saturdays.
I can't help you on that.
Okay, all right. No, have you ever thought of Sundays or something? Or
Well, it's up to them to plan more in the future. But you know, I work very hard to get them to do one in the Bay Area. I mean, I try to get a board meeting in the UCSF also. So they're working on it. I don't know. See if in the future we could get a board meeting up there. But at the meantime, I got them to have the DEA seminar on the UCSF on this January 27th.
all right then. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you. Any other public comments? Okay, we'll move on to the,
I've got a board. Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay. I've got a board comment here. You know, one of the things that, as a board member, I get hit up on a lot is our site and fines. And people come up to me, they make comments, and I'm obviously unaware because, you know, we've got distance between us and the operations of the department. But as a board member, I feel like I should have a better handle on how the fines are given out, how they're mitigated, how how intense they are, and just a kind of a sense of oversight so that I can speak to these people rather knowingly of this. And I feel that none of us on the board have a good handle on that. So I'd like to get through the enforcement committee, get that on the agenda, and we can have some discussion on it and shed some light on it.
Thanks, Alan. We'll put it on the enforcement committee, just a review of the site and fines and how the board can be better educated on those. Great. Any other board member comments? Okay, we'll move on to agenda item 3, which is discussion and consideration of actions to implement legislation chaptered in 2017. So as we know, there's a lot of legislation that was implemented this last year, and now it's up to the board to implement them and maybe draft regulations and move forward with the rulemaking process. The first one is SB 351, which is the hospital satellite compounding pharmacies. So this creates options for hospitals that wish to obtain additional licenses from the board for purposes of providing pharmacy care. Specifically, the board can now issue hospital compounding pharmacy licenses that will not need to be located in the acute care hospital building. The measure also allows the board to issue a hospital license that can be located outside the general acute, the four walls of the hospital, but in another physical plant that's regulated under that same hospital license. So the board is right now is working with the department's IT staff to make modifications to the existing computer systems to incorporate the addition of this licensure, this new license program. And in the interim, staff will be manually processing applications and issuing licenses. So the application forms, and Ann, are they under review by DCA? How close are we to having these approved?
So I think we're hoping in the next week or two.
Okay. So that should be, that doesn't require anything else, just implementation on the application process.
Right, and then we'll use the manual until the IT piece is completed.
Okay. Great. Any board member comments?
I have a curiosity for staff. And manual processing, as we look at a lot of these issues, they're going to require manual processing because of the situation that we have currently with our software. And so we've talked very often about our software updates and the software the state is working on. Where are we on that? I mean, this seems like such a cumbersome way to deal with all of this, and yet I always feel like we're almost there with software.
So the department is working with the various, I'm sorry,
I think you have to talk into the microphone a little more directly.
is that better? So
Yes.
So the department is working with boards and programs that are still in the legacy systems, of which we are. And there's a new process. So it's not, it's called business modernization. And so it's a more robust system instead of just an automatic transition to the BRIE system that many others are using. So we have started the business modernization effort. And we, as part of the department's effort, at the staff level, we're working to identify what our business needs are going to be, to monitor the progress that is done. The department provides reports to the legislature on the implementation, so we can make an agenda item, a standing agenda item in organizational development to keep you advised of the business modernization.
Oh, I think that's a great.
Yeah, let's
great
also
idea.
add to that, Ann, the whole issue about renewing licenses on with credit cards.
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
So I'm sorry, and I don't want to, I'm preaching to the choir here, and I realize that. We spent a lot of money on Breeze and a lot of money that we've given to the department with the expectation that we would have a better system than we do today. And so is that money that has been spent without any advantage to us, or is there a horizon out there?
So I think I want to make sure with Laura, are we going off, should we agendize this for a future meeting?
So I was gonna look and see, I don't know if this is on or not, but I was gonna look and see if it might fit under org development.
We can't hear you.
Oh, it would fit, yeah, I think you're right, it would fit under org development, because we may have a update, because there have been meetings that Ginny, Ann, and I have had with the department.
I can wait on all of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
But we don't have work development agendized
So
for this meeting.
I think what I would suggest is if we can work with the org development committee and figure out the best way, and whether it's having the department come and discuss the pro rata specific to Breeze for the board, so everybody has access to that information, happy to do so.
Thank you.
Before we move further, I'd like to introduce the Dean of North State. Hugh Tran, do you want to come up here, please? And I want to acknowledge the Dean for graciously allowing us to use this conference room for our board meeting. Thank you, Dr. Tran, for all of your graciousness in allowing the board meeting to be here. We all greatly appreciate your generosity, and the schools.
Can I just...
Yes.
It's your microphone anyway.
Dear Madam President and distinguished members of the Board of Pharmacists in California, it is our distinct pleasure and honor to have you holding the meeting here at our on-off campus. And as we have mentioned, and anytime you want to come to on-off campus, just feel welcome. Yeah, I don't want to really delay your functions. So again, thank you so much for being here. It's a great honor for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for the offer. I think we try to do that UCSF and they try to charge us. Is that the same? So I'm really
Don't tell them
ashamed.
that.
I'm really ashamed to be alumni at UCSF. But really appreciate that to offer this facility to us. And I think last time I come to the DEA seminar, it was very nice.
Yes, thank you so much, and we are very pleased that you also support our the regulation update on the IV steroid non-steroid IV compounding this weekend as well. Again, thank you so much. Yeah,
Thank you. And we encourage your students to attend future board meetings.
I
We
will
have
take
them
note on
here.
that,
Be a
yes.
great educational experience.
thank you so much. I will
Thank
do
you.
that. Yes, thank you.
All right, any other board comments on SB 351? If not, public comments. Senate Bill 351, the hospital satellite compounding pharmacy. Okay, if not, we'll move on to SB 443, which is Senator Hernandez's bill on emergency medical services, automated drug delivery systems. So this creates an option for county emergency medical services to restock ambulances through use of an EMS automated drug delivery system. Essentially allows them to utilize automated dispensing cabinets that they didn't have the ability to do so before. You may recall that we had the LA County EMS medical director here about a year ago to talk about this with us. And this allows them to place these cabinets within a county-operated fire department. As part of the measure, the board can issue a license for the use of the emergency medical automated dispensing system, as well as a license to a designated paramedic. So a service request was submitted in terms of implementation, was submitted to the department to make modifications to the existing computer system to incorporate this new licensing program for the designated paramedic, which I'm assuming, Anne, is similar to a designated representative kind of license. And that draft application forms are under development. When programming is complete, staff will be until they're complete, staff will be manually processing and applications and issuing licenses. Do we have any? What's our timeline? Do we believe that that's going to occur?
So I believe that they're going to be submitted to DCA this week, and then they'll go through the review process.
So I note on here that there's a lack of funding. The integration of the EM ADDS into the computer system is not possible. So we're going to have to do manual processing.
Unfortunately, for that piece of the legislation, it will be manual until we can convert to a new computer system.
So you're talking about what we were just referring to, the Breeze implementation?
Correct.
So could we add this onto the org development in terms of an update? Because this is a lot of work to have to do this manually.
Correct. Absolutely.
And just for clarification, is this just for county emergency medical services? Or it also allows for private ambulance companies to use this? Correct, okay, just for clarification. And CAL FIRE, good, okay, state. Government or private. Okay, any board member comments? I actually think this is a really good legislation because it allows for a more secure mechanism to control substances than just having little boxes that they store medications in within the county FAR, the tackle boxes, remember that?
I sure do. We got plenty of them.
Any board member comments? Any public comments? Okay, moving on, SB 547. This is the Professions and Vocations, a Hill bill. We have implementation. We have a meeting with Director Graffillo and Ryan on the Legal Affairs Division. Now, is this the one regarding the attorney?
This particular bill gave us an attorney.
Okay, so what is our status on hiring an attorney at the current time? Because this bill, the governor signed this on January 1st. What recruitment efforts have have taken place on this?
To date, we have not initiated recruitment.
So could we entertain a motion from the board to direct the staff to initiate recruitment of an attorney per the bill that was signed by the governor?
Amy, I have a question first. So when the staff initiated recruitment of the attorneys, is there a process in place how that could be done? Do you have a protocol? What is the protocol?
Good question. Jenny?
I've been too quiet. I just took over your microphone too. There,
You gotta talk right into it.
I wasn't saying it. Now they can hear me all the way down in San Diego now. In order to hire any employee except very few what's known as exempt positions, there's a civil service process. And with that, we work with the department's personnel office. We have to have a duty statement. We have to have the authority to have the position or find a way to create the position. Then you go, once that's approved, then you send out notices that you have a vacancy, and then people apply, then you interview them. And you rank them, and you score them, and you hire the best qualified.
Who makes the decision on the hire?
We have some decisions about who sits on the panel. In this particular case, I would expect that it would probably be Ann and I, because we would be the two people most likely affected by the work of this individual.
Would it be appropriate to have a board member as part of that process?
A board member could be part of the process. Normally, board members aren't part of that process, but if the board's interested. It would be an interviewer, so I don't see that there'd be an issue. Unless there's a legal obstruction.
I'm trying to think.
So,
It's unusual for a board member to sit in on civil service.
Yeah, wouldn't we, I mean,
interviews.
normally we delegate things to the executive officer. I'm comfortable doing that. I'm comfortable doing that.
what would the scope of responsibilities be?
We envision the position to become a subject matter expert for us in the area of law. We have nearly everything we do is either state or federal law in origin, and we have a lot of overlay and complexity because of the interplay of those laws. And we are in an area where everything is right now moving towards opioids, automation, prescription authority, even in the price of drugs, and contracting with PBMs is an issue. So we need ongoing legal support at a level that we cannot get currently from our office.
I think that the boards in the history has had concerns about some of the delay on getting some of our regulations done. I mean, we just had an emergency regulation. What did that take, like 3 months or something to get done? So the ability, there's just so much work that's going on with the board that I think the reason that this was put in place was a dedicated resource would be better.
So do you need a motion to?
Yes.
So I would make a motion that, staff proceed with the process of interviewing and hiring an attorney for the needs of the board.
And I'll second.
Second from Debbie. Public comment? Okay, all in favor? Raise your hand. All right, Senate Bill 752, which is a Stone Bill, designated representative, reverse distributor. This establishes a creation of a designated rep reverse distributor license and shortens the period of time that an applicant must wait to retake the pharmacist licensure exam to 45 days. I think that was an issue last year when we had residents that didn't pass the exam and had to start their residency, so this will hopefully help them. A service request was submitted to the department to make modifications to the computer system. This seems to be a repetitive phrase that we have here in terms of making,
Regulatory programs this year.
well, just changing the computer system to Stan's point, to incorporate the new designated licensing program. In the interim, the staff will be manually processing applications and issuing licenses. The new application form has been approved and will be released after direction on the training programs is provided. What do we believe what's the timeline for that, Ann?
So that's part of the discussion that we need to have specific to. That's part of the discussion we need to have at this meeting is specific to, there's different ways that the board can approve the training courses, which is the requirement of the statute. So I believe that at the staff level, we're recommending kind of a two-path approach. One would be to allow the board to, as the board itself, approve training programs until we can get regulations in place that would then define the training requirements in regulation, and then it could be delegated to staff. So that's our recommendation. And at this point, if you decide to develop regulation, we would suggest that it be vetted through the licensing committee, who could then develop the the structure and provide recommendations to the full board. In terms of approving courses in the interim, we would like to suggest that the board staff be delegated the authority to review and then make a recommendation to the full board. Because some of the coursework is proprietary, we would not be able to provide the full course in a public packet. So we would be looking to the board to find out if there are very general types of things you would like us to summarize and present before the board.
So we're looking for two things. One of them is that we delegate to the staff to review individual training programs. And secondly, the licensing committee to review the pathway for licensing. And then, and the first one's just an interim until the second one is accomplished. Okay, do we have a motion in that?
So moved.
Okay, Stan motioned, Victor second. Any board member comments? Public comments? All in favor? I'm sorry, Laura?
Is that on? Better? There? Hello?
Now we can.
Oh, wow, you really do have to.
You got to get really close.
So I just want to clarify. So the motion is to do both actions, which is to delegate that authority for staff to do the initial review of proposed training programs and make recommendations to the full board, and then also to send it to the committee in order for them to work on possible.
Yeah, and as soon as the committee is finished with their work, the first pathway, which is the initial individual program, won't be needed
It
anymore.
would be, right, it would be superseded.
And what
Great.
about the 45 days?
So yeah, that doesn't require it. That's just implementation, updating forms.
Okay, cool.
Thank
Okay,
you.
so motion second, no public comment. All in favor, raise your hand. Okay, the last item is AB 401, which is remote dispensing site pharmacy, which is the telepharmacy bill. And this establishes a regulatory framework for telepharmacy, which means a remote dispensing site pharmacy. This establishes mandatory reporting by wholesalers of suspicious drug orders and establishes the authority for 2 clinics to operate from a single location, which means a single pharmacy, right? And can have 2 remote pharmacies. One remote, okay. So it says 2 clinics, that's why I'm just trying to clarify, from a single
That's a
location.
different provision. There's several provisions in AB 401. There's the remote dispensing site pharmacy. Then there's the 2 clinics operating from a single location under a common agreement. So there's a couple of different provisions. And then also in this was the mandatory reporting of suspicious orders by wholesalers.
So service requests have been submitted to the department to make modifications to the existing computer system to incorporate this new licensing program and also the co-located clinics. In the interim, staff will be processing manual applications and issuing licenses, and draft application forms are currently being developed. And our timeline for that?
So we just received feedback back on the clinic one, so that should be ready to be released the end of this week or the beginning of next. With respect to that telepharmacy one, because we have to do regulations first, we haven't been focusing a lot of effort on developing that application form because we have to do the regs.
Right, and I think that's going to be important, that the regulations have to be developed to establish the requirements, because we have a pharmacy tech that is going to be operating remotely from the pharmacist. So the licensing committee should be discussing this issue as part of its committee meeting that's scheduled for next week. And that we'll have more regulations or draft regulations forthcoming from the licensing committee. Thanks, Stan, for taking that on.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I have a comment on section 7H. It says, if a remote site dispenses more than 225 prescriptions a day each calendar year, then it shall cease to exist. Now, for a remote site to fill 225 prescription average for the whole year, for one pharmacy technician to handle it, that's a lot of prescriptions. I mean, I don't even know if one pharmacist could handle that 225 prescriptions a day. When you, for 8-hour shift, you almost have to do 30 prescriptions an hour. You got to do patient consultations, all the education. You talk to the patient, pull the stuff, sign the log. There's a lot of stuff to do. And who decided 225?
The legislature. It's been enacted. This is law. We're just working on implementation of the provisions.
So can you have, let's say you have a medical assistant who also has a pharmacy tech license. Can they wear both hats and do this service?
So if they're functioning under their license as a pharmacy technician in a remote dispensing site pharmacy, yes, they could have another license as well.
So that's how you get around it, Victor.
Yeah, but if you are the PIC and then you have to supervise a telepharmacy which has one technician or even an help to do 225 prescription, if any errors that make on that telepharmacy, you're going to be responsible. That's scary.
I agree with you on that, Victor. It sounds pretty scary to me.
But this isn't saying only one person. I mean, there could be. I mean, is your concern that it's one PIC?
There
You-
has
you-
to be a pharmacist supervisor over the 2 technicians, and there's a cap at 2 technicians. This would be an extraordinarily busy pharmacy, and I believe, I don't know why we didn't make an issue of it earlier, but the bill was enacted like this. This is the absolute cutoff, at which point the pharmacy would have to cease to exist without having a pharmacist in it. And it was, I believe, probably established at a relatively high level, thinking very few pharmacies would ever get to this level, because keep in mind, they have to consult on every single prescription that comes out of that pharmacy.
But I guess my point is, this doesn't say that one person has to review those 224 prescriptions. Because the 225, they have a new they have to create a pharmacy. But this doesn't say that one person is reviewing the
Right, they get to
225.
follow the ratio, right? I mean, there's.
They have to have a pharmacist in the remote or
Right.
in the real pharmacy overseeing everything that those 2 technicians are doing.
But, I mean, it could be more than one pharmacist overseeing it.
It could be more than one.
So I understand your point, but I think this is not saying one pharmacist is reviewing all 200, and I'm going to say 224 because at 225 it could be more than one pharmacist doing it.
Unless at the supervising pharmacy, you have 2 pharmacists. Or more. Okay, if you only have 1 pharmacist at the supervising pharmacy,
Yeah, but
then you could only have 1 technician at that remote.
You could have 2.
yeah, you could have 2.
And it's D, 8, D on page something.
The regular ratio for retail pharmacy is 1:1. Why would you want to allow 1:2 on the telepharmacy?
It says notwithstanding section 4115, a pharmacist is, at a supervising pharmacy may supervise up to 2 pharmacy technicians at each remote dispensing site pharmacy.
Yeah.
It's on the next page of what you were talking
I know. He has to, or he or she has to supervise 1 technician at his own pharmacy, in addition to supervising 2 technicians at the other pharmacy doing 225 prescriptions. You don't think they're going to make a mistake?
Yeah.
And they'll be responsible.
I have a problem.
So can 2 pharmacists, if you have 2 pharmacists at the supervising pharmacy, does that allow for another 2 techs at the remote?
I think what it says in here, what I see under, it says notwithstanding section 4115, a pharmacist at a supervising pharmacy may supervise up to 2 pharmacy techs at each remote pharmacy. The subdivision shall not be construed to alter a pharmacist's ability to also supervise pharm techs at the supervising pharmacy. So it sounds like it's in addition
So,
to the current physical pharmacy they're at.
so it even is a greater challenge than what Victor has said, because 1 supervising pharmacy can have 2 remotes.
Yes.
And so at each remote, there could be up to 2 techs for 1 pharmacist.
1 remote. You could only have 1 remote.
I thought you could have 2 remotes.
I believe is that on? Did I do it right?
Is it 1 or 2?
I think it's 1-to-1,
1 remote for 1 pharmacy.
right?
Okay.
But I think
that-
what your position is, you can also have local techs in your pharmacy.
Right, you still have to supervise your tech in this pharmacy.
May, if you have that. But keep in mind, just, is that on?
Yes, you're not close enough.
You're just not close enough. You're still not close. You're still not close enough. We took ours out of the stand and we're holding it like we're rock stars.
I'll go with that. Oh, much better. Keep in mind that just because the pharmacist can do that doesn't mean that they should or that they will. So even though they're allowed to process up to 225 prescription, it's the 226th that means that now they don't get to be a remote dispensing pharmacy anymore. But that doesn't mean that the pharmacist can't exercise their judgment and say, no, I'm not able to do this consistent, do everything I need to do as a pharmacist and get my job done. So I understand what you're saying, which is that the possibility that they could do it concerns you, but overlaid on top of that would be an expectation that you would expect the pharmacist to exercise their own judgment about whether or not they're able to effectively supervise or act as a pharmacist in that way.
Stan, when the licensing committee reviews this, can you also review the patient counseling? Because on here it says that they can use audio-visual communication. What should that look like? What are the requirements so that the patient's safeguarded? I'm sorry, Albert.
Yeah, so right now, our current regulations, one pharmacist and one technician. So what you try to tell me is that on this new one, that they're gonna have one pharmacist, one technician, and additional 2 technicians, so total 3. So how can that jive?
And if I remember correctly, there's also some very specific review and standards for those technicians too, right?
Yeah, it's a special license category.
The technicians are going to be specially reviewed and have to meet certain standards. And I'm sorry, I don't know what they are off the top of my head. If you want to postpone that item, I could probably look at it and then we could come back to it and talk about sort of the protections that are in there.
To be honest with you, even a pharmacist myself, if I have 2 technicians, when I do 225 prescriptions each day, I still would make mistakes. Even if a pharmacist carry 2 technicians with me to do 225 a day, there are going to be mistakes made. Not talking about no pharmacists and just 2 technicians.
Right. Well, the bill has been chaptered, so
I think the board is pointing out a tension that I think was discussed at the time that this bill was proposed, which is, there are those who are advocating for greater services in rural areas and claiming, and I don't know the truth of it one way or the other, that there's no way to get actual pharmacies in those locations because there's no pharmacists that can be hired or they can't afford to hire the pharmacists or whatever the case may be. So clearly there's that perceived need balanced against the perceived difficulties that Victor and others are pointing out. And the legislature has made that choice. Now, we may discover in the first year or so of implementation of this bill that it does present the kinds of problems that you have identified. But I think before the legislature was willing to hear that, they probably would need that kind of data. So.
Yeah, I was going to suggest the same thing, Josh, is that we're going to have to track this really closely, including even the controlled substance inventory and what happens when there's not a pharmacist there to make sure.
So what you need? You need to show how many citations and find somebody for probation before they'll be convinced that this shouldn't happen.
Right. I mean, Ginny or Ann would have a better sense of what exactly. So I think we just have to see how well it implements and what kinds of problems it might present.
But I think too that we have some latitude in establishing the qualifications for the technicians that are going to be working in these facilities. The board needs to be cognizant of the degree of supervision and the potential number of prescriptions that could be running through that pharmacy and build that into the qualifications for the specialized techs that work in these environments. I think you need to, and then we may still need to, the board may choose to want to amend the statute.
Where are the qualifications that about the techs? Where this?
So that is going to be vetted at the licensing committee meeting next week to develop the regulations, and then it'll be brought to the board.
Well, not so much the qualifications, but where's it saying here that these have to be the techs with greater?
So under the law, it says that they have to be specially trained or specially, in addition to the qualifications of a tech, they have to meet other requirements as determined by the board, and so that's what the licensing committee is going to be vetting.
Section
Where in here?
4132.
A.
Yay.
In addition to the requirements of section 4202, a pharmacy technician working at a remote dispensing site pharmacy shall meet the.
Okay,
qualifications-
I'm with you. Okay, good.
Sorry, didn't mean to read to you.
So it's a licensing committee.
I liked it.
Well,
We
the
always enjoy-
licensing committee will determine what that is what you're saying?
Right, and this will obviously feed back into the ongoing discussion the board has been having about pharmacy technician qualifications generally, so.
Another part of this bill is that the wholesalers have to submit suspicious order monitorings to the board. I see that there's been about 50 that have been submitted so far. How are we doing with those?
We have received about 50. We've sent out notifications, I believe, to some of them. I have a meeting next week with the Wholesaler Association that oversees large wholesalers. We are in the process of rolling this out and establishing a means by which we're going to evaluate the data we get. But right now, it's pretty impressive. A week in, and we've got at least 50. So we're going to be busy.
That could be overwhelming.
Either that or we're getting everything that even remotely looks suspicious is being reported now.
That's kind of scary.
Well, we're going to have to find a way through this because it's a substantial workload. But it's part of what we need to do, and it'll help involve us earlier in the process where a pharmacy starts purchasing large quantities of controlled substances that we otherwise would not know about.
What is the board's role in reviewing some of those suspicious order monitoring protocols? And are they consistent? Does the inspectors review how those suspicious order monitoring rules happen?
We will, that will be part of what we work with. Right now, that we know the wholesalers in general are under a great deal of scrutiny federally, and so that they are being reviewed very carefully, I suspect, by the DEA, or at least at a level. I wouldn't be surprised if they were being reviewed at a level that they haven't been in the past. But nonetheless, we now stepped into this. This is part of our regulatory authority, and as the largest state board of pharmacy, I think we have an obligation to make sure that what's coming into the state and being dispensed within the state is appropriate and not fueling this opioid epidemic. So that's part of the reason we wanted to do this.
Would it be worthwhile to maybe have the enforcement committee take a look at the suspicious order monitoring protocols, maybe have the wholesalers do a presentation? Yeah. What do you think, Alan?
Well, I think that's a great idea. You know, but I'm kind of wondering about the enforcement. Well, the in-state. Those 50 notifications, are those some of those from out of state?
California pharmacies right now for the most part. Most of them have come from one of the large wholesalers.
Oh, okay.
We've gotten some though from, there have been 3 wholesalers that have reported to us so far.
Okay, because you know, well, of course they've been federally, isn't this?
They report to the DEA and have for years.
What they're doing, Alan, is essentially taking the same report that they are sending to the DA, they're just sending it to the Board of Pharmacy. So it's not extra work for them, it's just things that they're already doing. They're just forwarding it to the board.
Okay.
Any other board member comments on this item? Victor?
Oh, okay, so when they do, now that you have 50 reports, so how do you proceed? I mean, do you still send the inspector the next day, or what do you do?
We don't, we probably, in rare cases, would not be sending the inspector the next day, although perhaps I shouldn't disclose that publicly. We will evaluate, these will be a source of complaint, much like any consumer complaint we get or any other complaint that we get to the board. It will be reviewed by a supervisor and then by an inspector before we send someone out typically. Depending on the severity and the volume of the suspicious nature of this, some may generate reaction faster. But it will become a source of board investigations. That's part of the reason we asked for it.
Do you look through the history, or do you just check on one instance? Sometimes a mistake could happen. They just accidentally send me like 5,000 oxycodone, but which I don't even need, for example? Do you go through the
We'll be
history?
out this afternoon, Victor.
I mean, that's what I mean. Do you go through a history, like say, through a 2 weeks period, this pharmacy has ordered so much? That could be suspicious rather than just single out 1 or 2.
I think that's a question for the wholesalers in part in terms of how they determine that someone is giving
Suspicious.
a suspicious or an excessive sales
Yeah,
change.
there should be some criteria that,
But that's also part of our regulatory turf in making an evaluation of whether or not that wholesaler made the appropriate evaluation too.
okay.
That's what we're asking the enforcement committee, Victor, to look at, is what are those criteria out of the wholesalers? Alan, did you have a comment?
Not yet. Thank you, though.
Any other board member comments on this? Otherwise, public comment? Come on up, please, to the microphone so we make sure the webcast can be heard.
Actually, we're very close to one of the wholesalers right here.
Good morning.
Morning. I just want to mention about this large purchase of an opioid by the pharmacies. Just want you to aware that we're having a nationwide shortage of injectable opioids. And the hospital I'm working at, we're really down to wire. We just don't have enough injectable opioids. So whenever there is one available from wholesaler, I mean, literally, we're buying everything we can possibly get just to get through. So you're going to see some fluctuation of purchasings. Until the market stabilizes, I just cannot guarantee that. And I just don't want to see, I guess, unwarranted or excessive enforcement. Just please look at the current market situation with the drug shortages.
I assume that's everybody out there.
Everybody out there. I mean, we're just struggling. And I heard that even Mass General in Boston, they're not even issuing an injectable opioid unless it's absolutely necessary because they don't have enough.
What in particular?
We
Or
just
all
don't have enough fentanyl. We're actually trying to make our own fentanyl drips, but we just don't have enough large volumes. 20 ml, 10 ml, 30 ml vials are not available at all. And the dilaudid is not available. Carpojects are just all gone. Morphine PCA is just dry. There's nothing out there. So
Is that
when
because of the limitations in production, or
it's a Pfizer issue. So Pfizer, they had some issues with the manufacturing that created a market supply and demand modification to the equation. So it's just that literally every hospital is struggling. They're just trying to keep up.
But typically, the wholesalers in that situation establish allocations. And the allocations are set up to kind of distribute to the widest possible group so that we don't have these shortages which run rampant. The other thing that we have seen in the past when this occurs is we have pharmacies that come into the marketplace, purchase the drugs from the primary wholesalers, and sell to the secondary market. That is
Right.
illegal in California, and we will be looking for that.
That's great. Yeah, we would really appreciate that. Yeah, but just to be honest, wholesaler not always set allocations. It's almost like we're looking at our wholesaler webpage every day, every hour to see what's available, and then we're just clicking the mouse and say, just buy it and just to survive.
Well, we recognize it's difficult. We've got a whole series of drugs that are in short supply. It's the way pharmacy now operates, is in a world of shortages. And keep in mind that we're aware of that, but nonetheless, there's frequently manipulations in this that kind of drive things to a worse
Absolutely.
state, and that's part of what the board will be considering.
Right, absolutely. Okay, thank you.
I think another factor we have to keep on the horizon, and I agree with you that there's been a lot of issues, that the DA is also asking to ramp down on the actual manufacture of controlled substances as part of their opioid reduction strategy. So that's going to also have an impact to the market as a result. Okay, any other public comment? Otherwise, move on to agenda item 4, which is discussion and consideration of draft reports to the legislature. There are 2 copies of reports that are included in your packet. During this meeting, we are asked to review and to amend as necessary and then approve the reports that can be finalized and submitted to the legislature. Because the December 2017 board meeting was initially canceled due to lack of quorum, a draft report was provided to the chair of the Assembly Business and Professions and Senate Business and Professions and Economic Development Committees until the board could meet, discuss, and approve these reports. So the questions to the board directed to respond are, number 1, a detailed description of the board activities related to inspection and licensure of non-resident pharmacies or outsourcing facilities. That was one of the questions. The other one is whether the revenue collected pursuant to subdivision 5 of section 4400 and travel cost reimbursements collected pursuant to subdivision C of the section provided revenue in an amount sufficient to support the board's activities to these out-of-state reviews related to the inspection and licensure of non-resident pharmacies. In the case of outsourcing facilities, whether the fee collected pursuant to subdivision 10 of section 4400, subdivision X of section 4400, and travel cost reimbursement collected pursuant to subdivision C of section 4129.2 provided revenue on the amount sufficient to support the board's activities related to the inspection and licensure of non-resident outsourcing facilities. Number 3, the status of proposed changes to federal law that are under serious consideration and that would govern compounding pharmacies, including pending legislation before Congress, administrative rules, regulations, or orders under consideration by the FDA or other appropriate federal agencies in cases pending before the courts. And in the case of outsourcing facilities, the status of proposed changes to federal law that are under serious consideration, etc., as we just stated. Number 4, if applicable, recommended modifications to the board's statutory duties related to non-resident pharmacies as a result of changes to federal law or any additional modifications necessary to protect public health and safety. And the same for the outsourcing facility. Ginny, do you want to go over these reports, or Ann? Anything, Ginny?
Yippee!
There you go.
How much detail do you want? Let me just walk you through the questions. So the first question is a description of board activities related to inspection and licensure of non-resident pharmacies. What we've done is we've given you the statistics over the 3 years of implementing the sterile compounding program, and then in the outsourcing report in the limited period that we had been regulating outsourcers before we did this. So you can see the data, and you can see that it's pretty much kind of stayed the same. We are very busy. The licensure of sterile compounding pharmacies has very much driven the workload of the board's enforcement staff. We have a number of inspectors. All inspectors have been trained to do this, but certain inspectors do most of the inspections. So I don't know what to say other than we've got some inspectors that do the out-of-state travel. We try to allocate across various inspectors to do that so that it's not 1 or 2 people in the case of sterile compounding pharmacies that are doing that. But the numbers, unless someone has specific questions, you're welcome to ask me and I'll try to respond. What you can see though on page 5 is it talks a little bit about the type of investigations completed, and you can see we're either becoming more proficient at identifying issues in sterile compounding pharmacies, or over a period of time as we transition from giving corrections to violations and then to formal discipline, you can see that we're beginning to catch in enforcement investigations. So in the final column down here, the last table on page 5, we've gone from 6 investigations of non-resident pharmacies, sterile pharmacies in 14-15, which we had very limited ability until we started inspecting them to do much. We are now up to 35 over a period of 3 years. So we're detecting and monitoring, and we are enforcing California standards for the medications being shipped into the state. Any questions?
I just have one question, and I think it's very simple, but inspections performed, like if you look at 1617, it says 953, but there's only 884. So that means in some cases, probably because we're doing an investigation, we're visiting a site more than once. So that would take into consideration the multiple visits.
Maybe, but sometimes when they move to a new location, we have to go out and inspect them before they
Okay.
can start shipping.
Okay.
If they have an ownership change, we have to go out and inspect them again. So sometimes there's various reasons why we will have to go back out too.
Okay,
And I
thank you.
think that's happening a lot, Debbie, with the waivers and the sterile compounding. In terms of the waivers and the fact that construction's going on with the new regulations. I think, and the question I had for Jenny, I think it's fair to say that if you're doing sterile compounding and you have a license and you have a pharmacy, you're probably getting a greater degree of scrutiny than the average pharmacy.
You're getting more of our attention. But the sterile compounding, I think we all understand, this is a very risky business because we're in there today, everything looks okay, overnight something happens, and unfortunately someone gets injured. So we are very careful. It's probably the most attention, except for perhaps the outsourcers, where we really are very concerned about what we see. So we're very determined when we go in.
And a mistake in the sterile compounding, I mean, it could be death where having the thermometer wrong in a refrigerator doesn't have quite the implication. So, I mean, I think it's appropriate that we're high scrutiny.
Exactly, and keep in mind too, that a medical practitioner sees one patient at a time. Injury falls typically on one patient at a time. In the case of an outsourcer or a sterile compounder, you can be injuring numbers of patients at one time, as you saw in NECC, and that is a very weighty responsibility, and we take it very seriously. And we spend a lot of time training our staff and keeping them trained, which is also detailed in the report, which lies on the next page, on page 6.
Jenny, I have a question.
Yeah.
In 16, 17, you guys only added one inspector with all this extra work?
Yeah, and we reallocate it. But it takes a while. It takes about 1.5 years, 2 years to get a new position. You have to have workload to justify the position first, and so that takes a year right there minimum. And usually you need at least that. It's part of the state system. But we are able sometimes to create positions out of the blanket to demonstrate and respond to a need. And then you just build in the growth. But if you remember, in 2014, we had major problems in our licensing program because in order to accommodate this workload, it was very difficult for us to absorb that all. Because we went from, well, we don't even have the initial, but in the number of in-state sterile compounders, because hospitals weren't licensed prior to July of 2014, we had to absorb all of that workload. And anything that was accredited before that was exempt from licensure. So it became a very big workload, and it took a long time to do that. And the inspections alone, we inspect for everything. Okay, so we walked through the training and our ongoing training. Question 2 involves fee revenue. Our fees were initially too low for sterile compounding. We corrected that during our sunset review with a fee audit. And we believe the fee is appropriate to the cost of providing the service. So that particular issue has been resolved.
On page number 7, you talk about sorry. So on page number 7, you talk about the fee, revenue and expense, and it mentions unreimbursed travel expenses were attributed to 2 non-resident facilities.
Yes.
So are those facilities that refused to pay or didn't get billed, or?
They got billed and they didn't give us the money back. We probably denied their license.
Okay.
We try to estimate up front before we go out and inspect how much the travel expenses will be, but then we do a final reconciliation at the end, and we send them an augment bill. And in these particular cases, we didn't get the revenue back.
So we probably denied a license, or we did deny their license?
I don't know without pulling the file.
Can we follow up?
Yeah, there's only 2 of them that didn't get it. They're non-resident. My immediate reaction is we either disciplined them or we didn't renew them. But I'll find out. I'll bring that to the next meeting.
So it doesn't exactly say this, but we do think that the money we spent on travel, because we bill them for the exactly.
They pay for travel expenses. And it's one-on-one. So if your travel expenses were $4,300 and yours were $7,500.
I paid 43, she paid 75.
Exactly, and
And
that was
in
the only
addition, we
where we
pay
could do
the fee, which includes everything that happens behind the scenes.
Right, we bill for the time they're on the plane as well, because inspector time is valuable. Yeah, exactly. So we do that, and that was the only way we could figure out how to do this. For in-state, we don't bill for travel expenses. We build that into our fee. Question 3. What's going on at the federal level with respect to sterile compounding pharmacies? I just highlighted that there are ongoing guidance documents that are provided. These are brought to the board and we discuss them, and where appropriate, we make comments. So we are very tuned into where the FDA is going with respect to guidance documents federally and federal law. There is law. There are groups that are attempting to move the FDA back a little bit from regulating sterile compounding, the manner in which they're doing it. But that's proposed federal legislation at this point until it becomes federal enacted law. I'm not sure we need to be involved. We have very little ability to affect what goes on in Washington. Any questions on question 3?
Do we include, in terms of federal law, do we also include the whole USP chapters and
Our work in that area? No, because that affects the whole gamut of who we regulate as sterile compounding pharmacies, in state and out of state. If you want a paragraph or two added, how we're looking at national standards and laying those over the board standards, I can go
Yeah,
ahead
I
and
think
do.
it would be good to just to show that we are looking at United States pharmacopoeia standards when we review our regulations and all of the moving forward.
Okay.
Because I know that 797 and 800 are now under review to try to make them more consistent with the 2019 date. So it'd be good to add that in there.
What's Jenny gonna do? I didn't hear that.
Just add a chapter, just add a paragraph that says that we are also reviewing, because those are national standards that we really should be including in here as well.
Thank you. And then that's actually, that was question 4. So that concludes the report.
Oh, wait a minute here. You know, there's a, in this first document on page 9, there's a cut and paste error here. You've repeated question 3 as question 4. Who's responsible for this outrage?
Somebody,
It's a draft report, Alan.
it is a draft report, but one of the questions, yeah, they didn't pick up the question. Yeah, we'll go ahead and we'll pull this out. We will straighten that out in the final
Good
report.
catch, Eagle Eye.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you.
Make the board look good.
Well, I will tell you, I cannot rest easy, and I won't tell you how many people reviewed this. Okay, we will fix that. But what I would like to say is there are a couple of proposals back here. The first one, starting on page 10, we have proposal 1. This is listed in the report as a health and safety code change. It's actually a building standards requirement that's administered by the Office of, part of the Department of General Services or Building Standards. There's also a component of this that's being simultaneously reviewed by OSHPD, which regulates sterile compounding in hospitals. So right now, staff is working on amendments with OSHPD to alter the requirements for structural components in sterile compounding facilities and hospitals. Those same changes will be added into the building standards so that architects are aware of what's going on in the community sector if a community pharmacy is providing sterile compounding services.
This is just to make us consistent with our law.
Right, this is to make sure everything throughout the state, and part of the reason you have these building standards is so architects that are designing hospitals and pharmacies have access what the requirements are. So that's being done as we speak. That will be brought back to the board at a future time. So what's referenced there as proposal 1 is going to disappear. Proposal 2, however, we want to add into section 4312 that allows
Wait, say that again. So proposal 1.
is not a statute change. This is a building standard requirement. It was listed incorrectly.
Are we still going to let them?
We're still working on it. Staff is working on that, but that will be brought back to the board. It's not done yet. And other agencies, the good news for the Board of Pharmacy, other agencies promulgate those regulations, not the board. But because the board's involved as the regulator, we have the opportunity to provide comment on them. So proposal 2 deals with the voiding of a license after it's failed to be operative for a period of time. And we recognized relatively recently that we had a sterile compounding pharmacy that was not listed in here where we wanted to void the license. So we have added it in. So that's all we're doing at 4312.
So we're going to end up in this then only having proposal 1.
Only proposal 2. We'll
I
have
mean,
one
right, and we'll
proposal,
have
but
one
only
proposal.
proposal 2 we'd like to submit.
So and I'm assuming that you're gonna change in the first sentence of proposal 2 that we also recommend.
Yes, we will modify so that it reflects as a solo recommendation. And that, we hope, will be a relatively straightforward process to amend that. So that concludes the comments on sterile compounding. Any other comments? Does the board want to approve it with changes right now before?
Let's open up for public comment.
Yeah, and can I
good
make
idea.
one?
Any public comment on this report?
And if I can make one quick comment, which I think is probably self-explanatory, but it looks like in the text of the second statutory proposal, the hyperlinks got underlined.
Yeah,
those
they
don't
weren't supposed
those
to.
don't.
I've already pulled them out of my
Yeah,
copy.
so if you see in the draft that you have, it says section 11,500 of part
Okay.
1 of division 3.
Yeah.
So where you see a cross-reference, it's underlined, but that's probably because
It's
the
not new
original
text.
document was a hyperlink,
Yep.
but it's not new text.
We probably just want to do a spell check, grammatical check on this as
Well,
well.
this is a little, yeah, but this particular one shouldn't be in there, but I'd already pulled those out, so.
I only raise it because you're talking about a statutory proposal, and I want to be really clear for the board what the statutory proposal is, so.
Okay, any public comment? So do you need a motion then? to-
I would like
Amy.
to approve the 2 reports independently.
Okay,
So,
so is
yeah.
there a motion to approve this report?
I have one comment.
Yeah.
I know it's important to inspect all this pharmacy initially, but in the future, as we go down the road, is it really necessary to go back and inspect them every year? Can we save some of the
I
travel
think the
costs?
answer is yes. You know,
I agree with Debbie. There's a lot of changes that can happen, and we're finding more things, as Jenny just noticed, from year to year. So I agree. I think it needs to be done
Well,
every year.
you know, I think that's true for this period of change, but after a few years, after 797 has been revised and 800 is enacted, we might check the number of citations, corrections, et cetera. And if there's a chance to decrease the workload on that, it might be appropriate. But in the future, not now.
Right, and the reason I'm kind of agreeing with Debbie is that I think California has taken the high road and has had really strict standards. Those same standards aren't being applied in other states necessarily. So they're really operating under their own state standards, which may not be to the highest level that we have.
Oh,
So
no,
that's one of the
that-
reasons the non-resident, I think, is really critical. Okay, so is there a motion to approve the report to the legislature of inspections of non-resident sterile compounding pharmacies with the edits that we've just provided, Jenny?
I'll make that motion.
Debbie? Second from Ricardo? Any public comment? All in favor? Okay, moving on to the second report, Jenny, you want to give us that?
Yeah, this one is a little shorter because it only really covers almost a 6-month period instead of a 3-year period. And question 1, let's see if we duplicated question 4. I can hardly wait to get back there. I'm building suspense for this, for God's sakes. Okay, we list overall our inspection activities in question 1 as we respond to what we've done to inspect and license non-residents. I will tell you that the non-resident sterile compounding requirements turned out to be a lot more of a requirement and a lot more learning and a lot less of FDA interface than we thought. We have become a very highly trained in the area of outsourcing, in part through the FDA providing us with training. But we are detecting now violations the FDA is not detecting. So I'm very proud of what the board staff is doing. We're really making a difference here.
So a question I have on page 4 where we talk about the inspectors. We appear to have 9 supervising inspectors and 2 outsourcing team inspectors, and total board inspectors of 50, right, currently?
Right.
In terms of coming up, so the 9 supervising inspectors, are they overseeing the 52?
They're overseeing the 50 inspectors.
Okay, and the outsourcing team inspectors, are they being
There's
overseen?
one outsourcing supervisor that's overseeing 2 assigned outsourcing inspectors that are assigned to the team. And then some of the sterile compounding inspectors that serve on that team also do outsourcing inspections. And so in that case, this particular supervisor is coordinating that work.
Okay.
So why does the outsourcing one include 17 and 18, and the other one, the compounding, ends at 16, 17? I'm just
sorry.
wondering if this is going to the same people, would they question that?
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
So if you look on page 5.
Oh, because we didn't start issuing permits until July of 2017.
So the first report you did has 14, 15, 16. Why wouldn't you have 17, 18 if you
Because
had it in the other one?
the statute wasn't enacted until 2015, so it didn't take effect until 2000.
So I'm not asking really as much about this one as about the prior report, why we don't have that additional year.
Because we would have had nothing else to report there. We just stopped the report at July at the end of 3 years.
Okay, so this
If you want us to add additional data, we can go back and insert it in. If we would have stopped it at 16, 17, we wouldn't have been able to tell the full
once
picture.
again,
No, I hear what you're saying.
I'm not worried about this report. I'm looking back at the other, and I'm
No,
just
part of it too, Debbie, maybe is the other report talks about historical workload. And this one talks about staffing, so it may be a little bit different. Prospectively, maybe you can look at the staffing, but from a workload perspective, you probably want to look in arrears.
okay. I mean, it looks like it's the same 4 questions. That's the only reason.
Well, they're more or less the same 4 questions, but the data is generated a little differently. And keep in mind, we have a lot more. We have 1,100, I think, sterile and non-sterile, non-resident and resident sterile compounders. So if it's important to the board to add in another 6 month worth of data, we can generate it because the data is available. It's just we stopped the report. This report was written back in October.
Okay, and not to be picky then. So then fiscal year 17 and 18, you don't really have the whole fiscal year. So is it year-to-date fiscal year 17, 18?
Yes, and hopefully someone that reads the report and sees the data on the report would recognize that we wouldn't have a full year's worth of data.
Or do you put on that column fiscal year 17, 18 YTD?
We can,
Yeah,
we can do
I
that.
agree with
All right,
Debbie.
we'll do 6 months.
And just asterisk and put what months those were
Yeah,
included.
okay.
It's a very good
We'll do.
point. The other thing I
I'm
noticed
happy with
under the
that.
licensing statistics is it looks like the non-resident applicants have gone down from 26 to 9. Is that just because the higher number in 16 was because it was a new program?
We had a lot of applications early on. We haven't been able to go out and inspect them. And so everyone turned in their application early, but we were unable to get out to see them because we weren't going to do inspections until, one, they've been inspected by the FDA, and 2, our staff was trained and in position to evaluate the outsourcers. In the case of the 9, that's just the number of applications that came in, but keep in mind nationally there's 73 of them, or at least there were at the beginning of probably November when this report was generated. So over here we're talking about there were 73, on December 1, 2017, there were 73 FDA registered outsourcing facilities, of which we're only dealing with a few. Okay? Okay, question 2. Fee revenue, is it sufficient? We matched our outsourcer fees to those for sterile compounding. The jury, we didn't have enough data yet to generate whether or not our fees are appropriate. I think long-term it's typically taking us about a week to do non-resident sterile or outsourcing facilities, and at the current time we're sending 2 individuals, and so accordingly our fees may need to go up for that. We collect the travel expenses, but the application fee is the same as we charge for sterile compounders. We have nothing else to base it on at this point. So we have an incomplete answer there. Question 3. Status of proposed changes to federal law regarding outsourcers. Again, we have constant contact with the FDA in the area of outsourcing. We've had, unfortunately, a tragic, well, no, that was a sterile compounding death, never mind. We are involved in several large recalls that are going on right now with the outsourcers, and we are very actively involved. So I think at this point there's not much more we need to say on question number 3 than what is there in those 2 minor paragraphs, or actually 3. And we're not aware that the FDA is working on changes to CGMPs at this time. And then finally, do we have recommended modifications to the board's statutory duties? At this time, we do not. So are there any questions on the report?
Any board member questions, comments? Public comments? Is there a motion to approve the report?
So moved. Second.
Stan, motion, Ricardo, second. All in favor?
Public comment.
We did.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you.
All right, thanks Ginny and Ann and staff for, this is a lot of work that went into this. Thanks for providing these reports. Okay, going on to the next item, which is item 5, which is discussion and consideration of possible statutory proposal relating to the use of automated drug delivery devices. So this has been something that the Enforcement Committee has been spending a lot of time working on. Given the fact that the board approved a pilot program with an automated drug dispensing device, and this has been, I think, it's been like a couple of years that we've had this pilot in process.
How long? 3 years?
Forever.
Okay.
All right. As
Grab the microphone when you make comments that we're not talking into the mic as well, please, Ms. Sodergren.
So as
Sorry.
reported at the November board meeting, the Enforcement and Compounding Committee has been working on the development of a statutory proposal to expand the conditions under which an automated drug dispensing device could be utilized. The committee noted that there is benefit to patients by increasing access to medications, but we need to ensure that the appropriate security measures must be in place, and the board must be notified if any theft or diversion were to take place. If you think about it, these are kind of similar to ATM machines, except one holds drugs and one holds cash. But they both need to be safe. The committee also underscored the need for patient consultation when the ADDS machine is used to deliver medication to the patient, and making sure that counseling is in place to protect public safety. There also need to be a need for development of a self-assessment form that can be used for these machines, and locations where these machines are placed need to be inspected by the board. The committee recommended creating separate requirements based on the 2 different type of machines. So if you think about it, there's 2 different dispensing devices. One that the patient interacts. So the patient actually, and that's an example, is the Asteris machine, where the patient interacts and it's dispensed directly to the patient, and the issues of counseling and such come into play. The other is where the drug or unit dose is administered to a patient. So it is a machine where healthcare practitioners will interact, either a nurse or a physician, to be able to access medication for a patient. So for board consideration, the Enforcement and Compounding Committee considered the basic framework from which a legislative proposal could be secured. So we do need to propose, we would like to recommend a proposed legislation. Under the proposal, there's some existing statutes and regulations that would be replaced and incorporated. So the framework that we want to discuss with you at the, from the Enforcement Committee, and Alan, I should have you do this. You're the enforcement chair.
You're doing fine. You're doing fine. You got to roll.
Alan's made his contribution today already.
I have one other contribution. It's small.
He had his eagle eye, definitely.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, on the first page of this, we rather than dispense 240B drugs.
Oh, 340B.
Yeah.
Oh, good catch.
Oh my God, Alan, you're up for a bonus now.
There you go. So the first one is the definition. So we are recommending that creating by definition a delineation of the 2 different types of systems. So automated unit dose system, which means that there's a unit of dose medication that's dispensed to a patient, and that's inherently by a nurse or a physician that interacts with the machine.
Amy, can I just interrupt for just a moment just to point out to everyone that the salmon-colored piece of paper is the one that we're currently working with?
Oh, okay, very good. Thank you. That's the concept draft.
Correct.
Okay. And that is, and what I'm discussing is basically just the tenets of this concept draft.
Right, and I'm happy to go, as the drafter, I'm happy to go through it or not, as the committee feels appropriate.
Okay. So the definitions are included in there, and Josh, step in whenever you think you would like to. But there's two different types of systems, and they're both automated, but they're very different uses. Then there's general requirements. So we believe that the device must be licensed by the board to operate. So hospitals utilizing unit dose machines for administration to inpatients would be exempt from licensure. However, if there's an ADDS machine that's in a hospital, for dispensing in a hospital would be required to secure licensure. So that means dispensing to patients. Is that what is missing from that summary?
Can I just give
Why
sort
don't
of-
you take the, yeah, go ahead. John.
Sort of a 10,000 feet overview. As you pointed out, there's two different kinds of systems. There are those that dispense to patients. So ADDS will be the general category that will refer to both different types of systems, an automated drug delivery system. And then there are separate subdefinitions for two different kinds. The kind that goes direct to patients, which is an APDS, and the kind that goes to a healthcare practitioner for unit dosing, that's an AUDS. AUDSs will have no limit. Oh, okay. I'm swallowing the mic. Yeah. I've never had the problem of being too quiet, that's for sure. An AUDS will have no limit on the number. Both units have to be owned and their contents owned and operated by pharmacies.
In California.
In California. But an AUDS, a Pyxis machine or an Omnicell, those kinds of things, there's no limit on the number that any given pharmacy can own and operate. Whereas there is a limit placed with this legislation of 5. No pharmacy may own and operate more than 5 of the Asteris type or other types of direct patient.
The APDS.
APDS.
So can you just stop just for a sec? So the can you explain the logic behind the limit on the number that, so is that one pharmacy can only own 5? Or
So one pharmacy
owner,
can
like if-
resupply, because they'd have to manage the consultation for those 5.
So
I don't know,
if
how did
I'm-
we come up with 5, Josh?
If I'm just wondering if I'm an independent pharmacist, let's say I'm one pharmacy, I can only have 5 of these machines. But if I own 2 pharmacies, then each one can have 5.
Correct. There has to be an underlying pharmacy license for each of these ADDS licenses. So each pharmacy license will be entitled to have 5
So the-
ADDSs associated with it.
So the pharmacy would have to provide oversight of that. So the rationale
Right.
is that 5 is sufficient from an oversight
Right. It's similar to the
perspective.
conversation we were just having about these remote pharmacies. How many of these can any individual pharmacy reasonably oversee, resupply, supply all the consultation for? 5 was put in as a limitation, but again, this is a concept draft intended for discussion by the board. So that, and I also wanted to point out as part of my initial presentation, even if the board were 100% sold on everything in this draft is not yet ready because of the other statutes and regulations that need to, but that's something that we would do in consultation with Ledge Council to determine how best to integrate this statute into the existing statutory framework. So this is not an entirely comprehensive draft, but it has all the concepts in it.
Okay. So if I have an AUDS, I can have unlimited. But if I have APDS, I'm maxed out at 5.
Yes, as a
pharmacy.
Again, if you own more than one pharmacy, you can have 5 per pharmacy.
And I think part of the rationale behind that is with the AUDS, there's another healthcare provider that's interacting with the public and the patient that is safeguard. There's a safeguard. With the APDS, it's a last line of defense with the patient.
Correct.
And is there any history from other states where you grabbed onto the 5?
I don't know.
I'm
seen the
curious
5.
to hear what the public has to say, because I don't know if 5 sounds reasonable or not, but it just sounds
Well,
a little bit like a grab.
It seems, it does seem like an arbitrary number. And, but the way you're thinking, it seems like you're saying only 5. I think 5's a pretty high number there. What's your envisionment of
You know what, I'm sorry. I have to give Cheryl the mic in just a sec, but I kind of think I should have my own, but I don't know. Just
Well,
know-
There was a vote prior to the meeting not to give you your own microphone.
I was just going to say, Laura, note Debbie needs her own mic in the future because I've tried to share with Stan, that didn't work real well. I've shared with Jenny, that didn't work real well.
Is there a common denominator?
You know what? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, common denominator. Thanks. I don't know. I'm just really asking the question. I don't know.
I have a comment.
Okay, go ahead, Victor. I saw you wanted to speak.
To be honest, I totally disagree with the finding of the enforcement committee when they said there appears to be an increasing interest and increasing demand for these machines. I totally disagree with that because all you guys have is a study from UC San Diego for 2 years, and they barely even fill 30 prescriptions a day. And you call this an increased demand? Plus, on AB 401, Section 1A, it clearly says that the legislature hereby finds and declares that greater access to healthcare professional improve patient outcomes. Patients see their pharmacists more often than any other healthcare professionals. So making pharmacists readily available should be a top priority of the state. So even this bill states said that they encourage patients to see the pharmacist. And I don't even see how our own board would go and lobby the legislature and say, we're going to increase all this machine to replace the pharmacist consultations. I mean, particularly on 2H, like you said, you want to expand that the PDS to 5 machine. In California, it's totally different than in other states because we have a huge influx of immigrants from different countries, whether it be Hispanic, Chinese, Koreans, Indians, Iranian, Armenians, or Russians. And every one of these people bring in their own different cultural background, and they totally rely on the pharmacists of their own cultural background and values to educate them on medicines. And the pharmacists actually are the really great providers for them to educate them, especially on medicines and on patient outcomes. So when we are doing this to discriminate against these populations of patients, I think it's totally unfair.
So Victor, I disagree with you. And I think part of it is we're in an era, even with Amazon and everything that's out there, that consumer convenience is important. Counseling is not these are not just for new prescriptions, they're for refills. So right now, anyone needing to pick up a medication has to go when your pharmacy's open. If your pharmacy closes at 6, sorry, you gotta wait till the next day. The influx of mail order, it's the whole reason we have mail order, is access. Consumers want access, patients want access, and to have them wait until the pharmacy is actually open to access medication, I think is an issue, just from a patient access standpoint.
Okay, well, I agree with you, Victor. I think that there's a problem with that 5 number for me. I mean, that's what I wanted to comment on. How did you come up with 5? And
well, first of all, I don't think the enforcement committee came up with a 5. Let's clarify. I don't recall that discussion. Do you, Alan? I think this is something that's just come up from the staff for us for our discussion. So if you don't believe 5 is appropriate, let's have that discussion. But I want to clarify. I don't recall. That's the reason I asked. Where did this 5 come from?
The number is up there for discussion.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, nobody's loves 5.
Right.
It did not come up as an enforcement
I just
recommendation.
thought I missed something because
No.
I do remember a report that Victor was referring to where we only had 30 people using the machine, and that's why I'm wondering where did 5 come from all of a sudden?
5 came out of either my or Anne's imagination. I can't remember which of us is responsible for that.
Was the number of beers you had the night before?
I'm happy to take the bullet on that. The world cannot handle Debbie and I speaking at the same time. But the 5 was merely intended to provoke discussion, so I would say mission accomplished.
I just want to say, and no offense to the UCSD study, that I don't think we need to glob onto that as an example of what's happening out there, because I think I agree. There is a demand for it. Probably in Southern California, we don't see it as much because we're a very populated area, but I could see some underserved areas where these machines could be very helpful. But I think there's some of the rural areas, whether it be the clinics like we were talking about before with the text there, or this could be a solution. And it is about getting medication to the patients, and that helps with adherence.
Even with the reason we only have the remote pharmacy is because of that, is access issues.
And if the board doesn't become involved in this area, somebody else will step forward and do it. And this is the practice of pharmacy. I think that it's important that the board maintain a presence and balance the interests of the parties involved, and yet still retain the consumer perspective, because that's what we're specifically charged to do. But the machines are coming. There are multiple bills. In the past, we've seen bills coming in from other sides. And again, I think that if the board doesn't step forward and take the lead here, we're going to end up watching it happen to pharmacy, as opposed to being leading pharmacy in this area.
And as a consumer, I think giving options to them, as long as they're safe. My biggest concern is making sure they're secure, that the board is aware of it, that we ensure appropriate counseling and access to patients. I mean, really, if you think about it, we actually have less requirements for mail order than we do for these machines. Because there's not even a counseling requirement for mail order. I can pick up the phone and get a prescription under mail order, and I don't have to have any counseling.
I agree with Victor, what Victor said. And I also feel that, on the drug take-back, expired drug take-back, those boxes, we have to require them put in front of pharmacy and with a certain visual of this pharmacy staff. And now we go have all this device all over the place and no supervision and nobody keep an eye on it. And I have a problem with that.
And Amy, I need to disagree with you on the fact that the mail orders, they're not in high demand. These are people, they are mandatory, they're mandated to do mail order. Sometimes they didn't have a choice. It's not that it's popular. They were forced to it.
I think we have a difference of opinion, Victor, because I don't agree. I think mail order is something that a lot of people use. I frankly use it myself. I use it for my elderly mother. It's a lot of access. If you're busy and you need access, you don't always have time to go to the pharmacy.
We have many patients that they cannot go to the retail pharmacy because they were mandated by the PBMs or the insurance. So it's not freedom of choice. You can hear from the audience.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a couple different flavors of the mail order benefit, and it's probably not the PBM, it's actually an employer group that chooses the benefit, but they can choose a mandatory mail order, and they can also choose voluntary mail order, where it's a benefit the patient can have, but it's really not the PBM that chooses it, it's the employer that chooses the type of mail order benefit
because it costs them less from a cost perspective, probably. But I think mail order is, all we're talking about, Victor, is options. It's not forcing mail order. It's not forcing automated dispensing cabinets. My position is providing patients with options. That's where I'm coming from. And I don't know, the other members, Ricardo, what's your feelings on this? This has been quiet. Stan.
I think with the studies that have been done, we're going off of one from down south. And I don't think there was enough people participating in that study. If you all recall, we had the numbers, we had problems with that. And if we're going to base something on just one study, or at least that's what it sounds like.
Yeah, I think we talk about that study because that was one we embraced, but I don't, and I'm not part of the enforcement committee, but I'm guessing that they looked at a lot more than the UCSD study, because there's a lot of studies out there.
Well, you may recall that the board hosted this technology summit, or I can't remember what exactly it was called, of various people to come in and talk about that. Now, obviously, that's vendor-generated interest and doesn't, necessarily reflect the actual market conditions out there in terms of the patient population. But there's certainly a lot of money invested in this industry, this technology, and as Ginny pointed out, the legislature has already started to respond to those vendors and others who are lobbying the legislature seeking this kind of bill. So I think Ginny's probably right that whether it's carried by the board or not, some kind of legislation on this topic is probably forthcoming.
Public comment.
Before that, Amy, I think you're definitely right. Why is the board so lenient on the mail order pharmacy? It really dawned on me when I became a board member here. I found out that we cannot do anything to the mail order pharmacy. You're definitely correct. Why? We don't even know the
I think
petition
that's-
ratio, who filled the prescription, how it was being done. Just
I think at a previous board meeting, we'd actually directed this issue to the licensing committee. Is it on the agenda for a review?
The licensing committee will be discussing the consultation requirements next week.
For mail order? Yeah, it's already on the agenda item that we. You got a lot on your plate there, Stan. Public comment.
Hi, my name is Sarah Lake. I'm from Asteris Incorporated, one of the vendors of an APDS system. I want to thank you all for President, members of the board, for looking at this topic and continuing to have us here to show our results of the pilot study. I want to remind you of a couple things. The pilot study was limited to employees. Sharp services a very few small percentage of their employee prescriptions. The volumes therefore have been low, and we've addressed and talked about some of those concerns over the years. We have lots of data from other states, which we've shared some of that with you, and we'll continue to keep that open communication. California was the very first state to allow for script center type technology. And when I say that, I mean patient-specific prescription pickup from a kiosk. And patient-specific is the key here. You were the very first state to allow this in 2005. Since then, many other states have allowed it and even expanded beyond that limited use like we have in California for the refills and next to the pharmacy, which is what we've been working with you on, is expanding that already existing regulation that stands today, that regulation 1713. Patients want options. Amy, you said it, and I think it's clear. Yes, some are forced to use mail order, some choose to use mail order. 30% of discharged prescriptions are never filled. The top two reasons: convenience and price. There is an issue around convenience. People are not getting their prescriptions filled, whether it's that person leaving the hospital is not stopping on the way home because there is no pharmacy there in the hospital, or it's not open, or they're not, we see meds to beds programs. That's why there are bedside delivery programs. We also see prescription access and prescription compliance not working in the retail environment because of hours of operation. Hours are getting shorter. It's expensive to have keep a pharmacy open. It's expensive to open a pharmacy. Let's expand access to prescriptions while maintaining that control. Every required counseling session occurs. It can be through our video consult or it can be over the phone. That's up to the board and how they want to regulate that. But we have the mechanisms to ensure that counseling occurs and every prescription is tracked at all times. So the security is there, the counseling is there, and now we can bring access to the patients of California. So thank you again for looking at this topic. We look forward to working with you, and we want to keep that communication open.
Sarah, how many states currently, just to give an idea to the board, how many states currently have this type of automation licensed?
So there's some level of regulation in or use in about 35 states. So some level. Some of that's, we have Illinois that allows all sorts of locations and every type of location. We have states like California, refills only adjacent to the pharmacy. So we really have a wide range of the allowances there. Many states are looking at expanding, working with Texas right now, Florida, Arizona. There are regulations on the table for that. So we can certainly look to, and legislation as well, not just regulation.
Sarah, I want to ask you, I'm not totally against high technology, okay? I know choice are good for patients. So actually, why don't you do a studies that you have one of these machines next to a pharmacy that patient can pick up the refills while the pharmacy is closed? And you do the statistic on them about the satisfaction on all these patients with all these label requirements all fulfilled and everything. Come back with us and then we'll see how that goes, rather than like putting one way out there nowhere that nobody goes, and utilizing a higher patient population base and use this for after hours and see how that works on the machine.
So 30% of all of our prescriptions, so we've delivered about 2 million prescriptions across the country. 30% of those are after hours. So we have that data. We did a study with the California Board of Pharmacy in 2005. That's how the original regulation was originally written. That study was with a system next to the pharmacy. It was for refills only, and it had to do with satisfaction of the patients going to the counter versus the kiosk. So we have some of those results. And again, I'm happy to share what we're doing in other states. But yes, in the limited employee usage at Sharp, that's the data we have. We look forward to sharing more data with you in March.
Do you have some summary sheet of what's being done in other states and the results?
I'd be happy to provide that.
Yeah, I think that would be good for us all to see,
Yeah.
Particularly the enforcement committee. And you said Illinois is a state that has.
They have a very expanded regulatory.
They also have pretty strict pharmacist prescription ratios.
And but they also require.
I think they have open ratios.
I thought wasn't Chicago one of the, they're limiting, basically looking at how many prescriptions a pharmacist can do
the number of
per work
prescriptions
hour.
pharmacists
Yeah.
fill, okay.
They also require, they're the only state that actually requires that each of the machines has their own DEA license and own pharmacy license number. So the way that they do the licensing is a little bit different in Illinois as well.
And Sarah, so 30% are after hours. It seems like and I think that's a big, plus for the machine. But the other thing is convenience, like you mentioned. What percent of the prescriptions are situations where the machine is maybe put in a, where there isn't a pharmacy, so people actually, pick up a prescription?
I'd say about 3/4 of our systems are not next to or in close proximity of the outpatient pharmacy. The ones that are in very close proximity to the outpatient pharmacy is when the outpatient pharmacy is actually located in a convenient location. Sometimes the outpatient pharmacy can be in not so convenient, especially for discharged patients leaving the hospital. So in those instances, we tend to see Script Center put in more convenient spots, like a lobby, or if it's for employees, maybe near a cafeteria or an employee lounge. And we're talking hospital, obviously, in those scenarios. Also a lot of military bases.
So in terms of trying to move this around, what about a compromise? Can we look at potentially having this for refills and for situations where a pharmacist has already counseled the patient? So there's already been an interaction with the patient. Let's say that there's a discharge, like a meds to beds program, where the pharmacist has already communicated and counseled the patient, and the patient's just being discharged from the hospital. So basically not allowing new prescriptions where previous counseling has not been performed. Will that work as a compromise to move us forward?
I like to see those. If you go into those machines, we would like to see a certain location, like right next to the pharmacy, within certain area. But if you say like the AUDS, I mean, you have unlimited those machine. I could foresee that in the future it could be like candy machine, soda machine is all over the places, and the safety of those machines is my biggest concern. So I would like to see those machines have trial on the site of the pharmacy, but not all over the place, unlimited place.
Well, isn't the patient, like if I'm going to get my pick up my prescription at, and let's say it's after I've been discharged from the hospital at a APDS, there's basically a machine I can go to, right? So so I think that it's not, so I think like the soda machines, Albert, I don't think they'll be all over because there's going to be a specific machine I have to go to. And I know from looking at the machines at our summit, and I have been to
NACDS.
your NACDS, is that where I saw it? And I've seen their specific machine as well as a couple others. I mean, there's a lot of security features in them. So I feel very comfortable with the security part of it. I mean, I know where you're coming from. We definitely want to license this, but I don't want all of a sudden these things popping up in doctors' offices or, wherever. And we, the Board of Pharmacies, aren't controlling them. I think, I agree. I think, Amy, you said it ahead of time. We need, or maybe it was you, Jenny, but anyway, we need to get ahead of it. So the Board of Pharmacy is managing, because these things are going to come out, whether we want them or not.
Right, and just to clarify, I think the AUDS, Albert, I think that has to be in some type of licensed medical, I mean, isn't it? We're not going to put them in gas stations. They have to be in a licensed facility, correct?
So within the proposal, it details the locations where these devices can be used. And for the unit dose ones right now, they're already being used in skilled nursing facilities and things like that. And there is currently, as at least that I am not aware of any restrictions in the number that a single pharmacy can use in terms of servicing maybe patients in a skilled nursing facility. So in the proposal, the ads machines could be used in a pharmacy that's licensed by the board, a health facility that's licensed pursuant to Health and Safety Code 1250, in a clinic as specified, and then in a medical office or other location where patients are regularly seen for purposes of diagnosis and treatment. And that provision there is consistent with the depoting provisions that we currently have in the law. The other thing that I just wanted to kind of highlight based on the conversations that the board has been having is that with respect to patient consultation, notice to consumer requirements and all of that, that's built in, indicating that the pharmacy that is using this must comply with those requirements when using the device as well. And so that is under H, where it says where the APDS unit is used to dispense directly to patients. The following conditions must be made. And so we're specifying that the clinical services need to be provided by a pharmacist that's licensed in California, that it must be accompanied by the similar consultation that's required if you went to a pharmacy counter. So a pharmacist would be providing you with patient consultation, and then any notices. So not only that a notice to consumer, but also like the point to your language notice and those kinds of things. All of those requirements need to be satisfied as a condition of using the device.
And for the APDS, my understanding is in this proposed general requirement, the board inspector would pre-inspect the location to make sure that it's safe and it's not in a gas station. It's basically in a place that's going to have appropriate security and have access for patients.
Okay, and if you can
Wait,
help me.
I think Victor's going to say something, then we'll have Debbie.
Amy, like you said, as a compromise, like you said, if we don't do this, somebody's going to come and do this. So why don't we compromise to one of the APDS located next to a pharmacy that patient could opt to pick up the refills after hours, and not the new
They
prescription.
can already do that.
We're doing that today. We've been doing that for a decade.
But that's not in the whole state of California right now.
Yes.
That's 1713 permits.
Since 2005, we have allowed Script Center or a.
Do we have a study? Do we have a study to see how things are going with all these machines?
There
Don't
are.
get complaints on the machine. We flat out have not gotten, I don't believe, a single investigation involving the machines, and I believe we have 3 or 4 of them in the state.
We've had
only 3 or 4.
But that's only because the market has
too
only
limited.
put in 3 or 4 next to the pharmacy, and they're expensive. But
If
but
there's a
again,
high
but we've
demand,
been
they will
doing
put
this
in
for
more.
10
It's too
right?
limited. It's too limited for refills only next to the pharmacy. If I'm a patient and I can only get my refills and then I have to go to a pharmacy for my new prescriptions, that's not good patient care.
But if you only get 3 or 4 in the whole state of
Because
California,
it's
how
too
would you
limited.
convince me this is in high demand?
because we're delivering prescriptions, all prescriptions in other locations around the country, 2 million
Other states are
prescriptions.
different than California. Okay, you cannot apply those. Other states' houses are $200,000 for a house. Look at California.
Well,
We're-
I
we're-
don't think the price of the house has to do anything with the A&E.
What I really, what I,
But I think I get to be next.
sorry, Debbie, go ahead.
But I think, Victor, that the board in 2005 was really thinking ahead of the game and allowed these machines, and as you described. But, so I think the board of 2018 needs to think in the future also. And kind of what I heard is it's about access and making sure people get their medications. So we've, and apparently having one of these machines, which I don't think are very cheap, next to your pharmacy for refills hasn't proven to be a benefit to the pharmacy nor to the consumer. So now it's time to look beyond that, and I think that's what we're trying to do, is look beyond that.
I have problem with the safety of those machines because it's
Can I ask you what it is? Because I think in our summits and our demonstrations,
I talk about. I mean the expired drug boxes in my pharmacy. They bolted down into the ground, and now you talk about all the machine all over the places. You know about the ATM machine. People using a truck, a chain, just take the whole machine with it. So I have problem with when you have all
what
these
if
machines
we
all over the places.
required it to be inside?
That's why I say I like to have certain location and certain, maybe in the pharmacy, hospital, those locations, okay, but
And
not all over the,
We've addressed that, haven't we?
So given the fact that, we had a lot of discussion on this, how about if we look for a vote and just decide if the board even wants to pursue this legislation? Let's start there, and then we can talk about what the tenets are. So is there a motion on proceeding with some sort of legislation to allow for automated drug devices sponsored by the Board of Pharmacy?
I would make that motion.
Okay, and Stan seconded. Okay, so let's just at least start there, and then we can talk about the tenets of what that's going to include. So are there any board member comments on this vote before we do public comments? Yes, Cheryl.
Okay, we're doing the telepharmacy in the remote areas, right?
Yes.
So where are these machines gonna go? You say we have 3 or 4 throughout the state for refills. So where are we gonna put the machines and what they're gonna look like?
They'll be probably in locations where medical offices, maybe there might be physicians that are dispensing that may prefer to just have a pharmacy do it and put a machine there. It could be in hospitals where patients are going
Controlled by
home.
pharmacists. They're gonna be controlled by pharmacists.
Yes, it'll be controlled by pharmacy. That's the whole reason, is it's better for a pharmacy to control it than to just have them out there. And there are some medications, right now, can a physician office install one of these right now? Under a physician's license?
Physician has to dispense to only his or her own patients.
But they can't.
They can't.
They could definitely do an AUDS, couldn't they?
Yeah, AUDSs are not currently limited because those are not being dispensed to patients.
Couldn't, if you're talking about remote pharmacies, couldn't the clinic or the pharmacy, they could choose one or the other. They could either do a machine or they could have the remote pharmacy that we were talking about. It's already in statute. So,
Or they could do both.
They can do both.
So it'd be an option.
We may want to even consider whether remote pharmacy should have ADDS. That's something that can be considered.
As I said, this draft is not yet comprehensive. For instance, I just noticed that although the definition makes this implicit, I think we should also have an explicit addressing what Albert was saying earlier, that only healthcare practitioners can remove drugs from an AUDS.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point. Okay, public comment.
Is that me now?
Yes. You're sitting right there at the public comment microphone.
Art Whitney with Pacific West. So my concern is you have defined the AUDS as an automated unit dose system. What about the automated unit dose system that is labeled?
So it's going directly to a patient?
No.
Say that again.
It's being administered by, it's the machine is providing the unit dose to the nurse that's giving it to the patient in the long-term care setting is what I'm referring to. And that is labeled patient-specific.
So it's a take-home medication.
No.
For administration.
Administration in the nursing home. So AUDS, if I see that, it is
So
much
give,
like...
give us an example.
Okay, the AUDS system would be like the OmniCell system that has emergency drug or first doses. A Talus machine is the same thing, but it's patient-specific labeled dosing.
Okay, but the Talus machine, my understanding, at least what we heard from the Technology Summit, is the pharmacy would provide packages or bins of
No.
medication.
We have 6 Talus machines.
Yes,
Okay, so we fill the canisters up,
correct.
and then the computer language back and forth is, so the nurse walks in at 9 o'clock at night or 11 o'clock at night and says, I need the next 24 hours worth of doses. And it prints them all out, packages them all, patient-specific, not unit of dose.
But it's for nurses to administer?
It's for unit.
So would that fall under AUDS?
Yeah, that's what I had in mind, at least when we said
Yeah,
unit
so-
dose. We
so
may
the-
have we may be using terminology that's incorrect in the SNF or license,
Right,
but
right.
but that's what we had in mind when we said unit
I think
dose.
that the differentiation with these is whether the patient, there's someone interfacing with the patient. In the APDS, the patient interacts with the machine. In the AUDS, the healthcare practitioner, right?
No, I understand that, but what I'm saying, there's a subcategory to an automated unit dose system, and that is the automated unit dose system that's patient labeled.
I don't think we need that subcategory because it would already be within AUDS. You need not
Okay.
worry.
Okay, great, thank you.
All right, any other public comment?
Good morning, board members. Danny Martinez with the California Pharmacists Association. I'm going to start off by saying that CPHA does not have an official position on this. Our board of trustees will be meeting in a few weeks to decide that. I did want to relay some of our concerns that we have on this this proposal on a more from a 10,000 foot level. In previous enforcement and compounding committees, I had testified that we had concerns regarding the lack of an ID requirement for these machines. Previously, I had said we are concerned that patients or non-patients maybe have access to these drugs that are not intended for them, and that's a concern that we have in terms of patient safety. I believe board president asked me last time, what happens in a traditional pharmacy, and I mentioned that when you go to a traditional pharmacy, you give your ID card. They check either visually or through a machine and verify that you're the actual patient. I'm not familiar with what kind of technology exists with these kinds of machines. Perhaps you can answer that. And I would also guess that there's more than one of these types of machines out there, and they're not all have the same sort of security requirements. So in other words, while one machine may actually have a function to actually check your ID, another may not. I think the biggest concern that we have is that we feel at the board, if they're going to move forward with this kind of proposal, have some sort of language in there that has a base. You must somehow, your machine must check and verify the ID of the intended patient. Second concern that we have is regarding the liability for the pharmacist or the pharmacist in charge. And understanding that this is just a framework and not a comprehensive item. Under 2G of the general requirements to specify the locations includes health facility, clinic, or medical office. And somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that a pharmacy and a medical office, like a doctor's office, cannot be located within the same building. Is that accurate?
You can have pharmacies.
I don't believe that's accurate.
Okay.
That is in there.
Okay.
You can have pharmacies and medical.
You may be thinking of a hospital with the physicians dispensing in a hospital ER. When there's a pharmacy there, they can't dispense out of the emergency room.
Okay.
I know what you're thinking.
Yeah.
It's a conflict of interest.
Yes, that's what where there's a conflict of interest where you
We can't have
there-
prescriber ownership, but other than that, I don't see any.
so
Yeah, there's a lot of pharmacies that are in medical buildings.
Well, so so I guess what I'm saying is in the interest of when you're, for example, if you were to put one of these in a medical office, generally a pharmacist would not be, if they're not having access to that, and something happens to that machine, they would be liable. but they're not physically there to make sure that nothing happens to that machine.
Are you saying that the machine would be linked to that pharmacy? They would place it into the medical office by choice?
But what I'm saying is that if that were to happen, so let's say I own a pharmacy and I'll put one of these machines in your medical office for, whatever business contractual agreement we have. If something happens to that machine, I'm liable even though I'm not there, and I'm not able to see whether you have the appropriate security measures in place to prevent any sort.
There's no requirement that the pharmacy must do this. So this is an option. There's no requirement. If they don't feel that the security is in place or they don't have oversight ability, they just don't install it in the doctor's office.
Okay, well, I'm saying this is some of the concerns that our members have brought to us on this issue. The last one is regarding to consultation. And again, my limited knowledge of the different types of these machines, consultation, whether it be through video conferencing, through phone, through whatever, still doesn't, at least in our minds, provide the security that they're actually talking to a pharmacist. Who knows whether they're talking to a pharmacist or the clerk? There's no way to verify that. Versus in a traditional pharmacy setting, you walk up to the counter, you see a label on their lapel with their name and a PharmD if they're a pharmacist, or a pharmacy tech if they're a pharmacy tech. And generally you'll be able to see certificates or their licenses somewhere up on the wall to verify that they are in fact a pharmacist. I don't see how you can do that with this type of machine and verify that somebody that they're speaking to on this consultation is actually a pharmacist.
If I may, I would state that it's better for the pharmacy to have control of that machine in that situation than a non-pharmacy that would have that machine in there, because the pharmacy understands the requirements in pharmacy law that only a pharmacist can provide those professional services, whereas a non-registered owner and a non-pharmacy owner wouldn't have that same obligation. I think keeping it in pharmacy's purview ensures greater consumer protection than leaving it unrestricted.
That may, and to a certain extent, I may actually agree with you on that. But what I'm saying is that in terms of this proposal, I think it behooves the board to actually write some sort of proposed language in there that's more of a uniform, this is how you need to operate if you're going to do consultation.
That's what we're trying to do.
I would imagine, though, that anything we do here is not going to usurp current law. And the current law does say that a pharmacist must provide that consultation. So that would be in place for this as well. And if a pharmacy elected to have a clerk do that consultation, then they're subjecting themselves to violating the law. And I don't know how you're going to circumvent that.
Yeah.
I'd just like to, I'm sorry.
I was just going to suggest that the requirements for prescribers to dispense to their own patients is actually in 4170, and it's pretty restrictive.
Okay.
So you may want to look in BMP code 4170.
Okay.
Josh?
I just wanted to respond to the first point, which is, to my knowledge, there's no requirement in current law that any patient be positively identified for purposes of picking up a prescription. So if we wanted to place that requirement into law, that would be a substantial sea change from current law. There may be individual policies at individual pharmacies or chains where they do that, or where they, for controlled drugs, may do it, or whatever, but there's no requirement in state law that I'm aware of that there be any positive identification of a patient.
That could add an access issue as well.
So I have a, I'm sorry.
No. I was just going to respond that I believe, the board and CPHA have both said that, patient safety is our number one concern. I would absolutely hope that the board feels that requiring, maybe just verifying that the patient who's actually receiving medication is actually that patient would be a top priority. So,
But I think what our counsel's saying is, if that's true, then we'd have to look at that for all pharmacy care. So that means that when you go pick up a prescription, to ascertain that you are actually an agent or you're the actual person. So if it's your child, if it's your mother, that could be an issue, or your neighbor that you're trying to do this for. So I think we have to be considerate of what current pharmacy practice is, which is, I think, what counsel said. So right now what we're voting on is whether to pursue a legislation to provide this. The tenets of that and what this will look like will be evolved over time if the motion passes, and CPHA will have full ability to provide input, as will any other member of the public.
Okay.
And we look forward to
So I'm going to call for the vote if there's no other public comments. So all in favor, and I think that was a motion by Stan to have the board move forward with legislation for licensing ADDS machines. Oh, is it Debbie? Okay, and Stan seconded. Sorry, it's been a while ago. Okay, all in favor, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Opposed? 1, 2, 3. Okay, motion carries. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. We'll reconvene at 11:15.
Thank you.
The restrooms are right outside the door in the lobby. We'll move on, and now that we've got that vote, I wanted to ask Josh to go over some of the general requirements so that we can fine tune. Now we can talk about what we need to have in there. So we'll go over the general requirements just to get the board's feedback to Josh so that we can move forward. So Josh, you want to take it?
Sure. So I'm just gonna. This is what's in the board's agenda item, the board item in the packet. I'm not going to deal with the specific language because that's just sort of a reflection of these principles. And I think it's more useful to make sure the board is comfortable with the core principles and let staff work on the language over the next period as we find an author. But these are the general principles that are encapsulated in this current draft. One is, of course, that the device has to be licensed by the board, and that licensure incorporates both an approval of the device and approval of the location for installation of the device. There's an exemption for hospitals that are using unit dose machines for administration to patients. Those don't have to be licensed. That the licensure has to be limited to pharmacies and hospitals located in California, that there's that pre-licensure inspection of the location, and that license is dependent on the underlying pharmacy license. So if the pharmacy license is ever lost, so is the license for the ADDS. There's application, pharmacy has to own the drugs and be responsible for the drugs as well as owning the machine. There's an application and renewal fee that will be synced to the underlying pharmacy license. And that the locations where it can be placed will be limited. Currently, the locations that are identified in the language are a pharmacy, a licensed health facility, a licensed clinic, and the medical office, which comports with 1713's depoting language.
But hey, Josh,
Yeah.
under E, it says, in addition to other uses and placements permitted by law. So in addition, the licensed pharmacy may place and operate the ADD in the following places. So what is the, when I look at placements permitted by law, in addition to other.
Well, the reason for that is there are various provisions in current law that, like 4186, which permits a placement in a clinic. And whether we are going to consider this completely a supplement to that or a replacement for that has not yet been decided.
Okay.
So that's just sort of a reminder, essentially, to us that there are other placements permitted by law, and we will need to resolve with Ledge Counsel or with the author's office how comprehensive an approach do we want to take? Do we want this to be supplemental to existing law, or do we want to, replace all existing law?
Okay, that was my curiosity. Thank you.
Sure. So, as has been, I don't know if you want to make this one of the core principles yet, but there's this limitation of placements to 5. We did go back and look at the committee minutes, and that discussion, that topic was discussed by committee, so that was a committee recommendation to make it 5. Not that makes any difference one way or the other, but that's where things currently stand, is that there was a committee recommendation to limit it to 5.
The board wants this less? Because I heard some comments about having less than 5.
I also heard, it seemed like Debbie was saying more than 5, although I don't know where Debbie is. So, okay, so anyway, maybe more, some want more and some want less. Maybe we'll end up
What's
back at
board
5.
comments? What's your input? Do you want 2? One's very limited.
I think there is obviously discussion about this, but right now it seems like there'll be more feedback because there's aspects that we might use that we might not be thinking of that will in health facilities that might.
Legislation, I think they'll probably get a lot of feedback.
Yeah.
It'll get changed during
Yeah,
legislation.
absolutely.
So whatever we put anyway is going to be a draft.
But I think we should limit it.
Do you want? What do you feel comfortable with, Cheryl? Do you feel comfortable with a 5?
No, absolutely not. I would say definitely less than 5. Or
2, 3.
maybe 2.
I mean, 2 is sort of similar. I mean, if you're going to look for similarities or analogs, we currently have the limitation of 2 on the remote dispensing pharmacies. So there's, there's, don't we? Isn't it? Aren't you? Yeah, you're.
They could have two.
Can't each pharmacy have only 2? A total, well, 1, but I mean 1, but yet they'd be overseeing a total of 2 pharmacies. So I guess whatever.
Well, the one that they're in and then the
Right,
other one.
exactly.
But I thought what you thought too, and I couldn't find it. I thought it was 2 pharmacies, 2 remote pharmacies for, being overseen by 1 pharmacy.
Maybe that was an earlier draft, and maybe both of us are.
But if we're trying something new, why can't we start off with 1?
I think Alan makes a good point, though. There may be
Well,
some
that's the reason why I say 1, because Alan does make a good point.
But this is going to be legislation, right?
Yes.
And so if we limit it to 1, a change would be very labor intensive to get. And so I hesitate to after this discussion, I hesitate to limit it to 1. I had originally thought, we need more restriction, but then the idea of a health system wanting to have several of these for discharge prescriptions, they could. Amy mentioned doing kind of a not virtual meds to bed, but a separated meds to bed.
What do you mean,
situation.
like when someone?
Like when somebody's leaving a hospital.
Well, I remember having someone speak to us about how important it is that these patients be talked to when they leave in the hospital by a pharmacist. So
Well, that's
certainly contrary to that.
So what a lot of what they're doing now is they're using telepharmacy and telemedicine for counseling. So there could be like a technician who has an iPad and the pharmacist and talks to the patient at the bedside prior to their going home. And then they could release the med on their way out to pick it up as their discharge. So there's a lot of technology that's out there that facilitates some of the counseling requirements, especially with discharge, because I think that was a good point on the discharge side, going home from a hospital.
Yeah.
Well, maybe, I don't know, maybe for purposes of getting through this meeting, maybe staff could come back with a draft that has between 1 and 5 number of units per pharmacy.
Maybe we could look at other states too, Josh, and see
Yeah.
what other states have done in terms of the ratios of numbers.
You're not, we can't hear a word you're saying.
Really bad with this. Better? Yes. Okay. So another option would be to have a maximum number and have the board have the ability within the statute to limit it by regulation.
Right. Yeah, we could say a limit of 5 or another number
Or a
designated by the
lesser
board by regulation or something.
That's true, because maybe in a rural area or a hospital, you might want a different.
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe in public comment by proxy, but I will mention that during the break, someone came up to me and mentioned how helpful this would be in Indian Health. So just as an example.
Okay.
All right, so we will come back with a couple of different language options on limitation on numbers. And then obviously the pharmacy is responsible for delivery and stocking of the ADDS units. That's something that the board's going to have to integrate. You may remember we've had this lengthy discussion of the pre-loaded cartridges and how those cartridges can be delivered and restocked for purposes of sniffs and so forth. So we may need to sort of come up with an overall solution on that question. And in this board packet is that any of these drugs dispensed from an APDS would be, but for the in-person nature, equivalent to a transaction at a pharmacy counter, in the sense of all clinical services, all DUR has to be done ahead of time, consultation has to be done in accordance with the board's consultation regulations, whether that's telephone or televideo, I don't know. And that the devices themselves have to have the board's notices that are required to be at the counter of the pharmacy. So, and trying to make it as close as possible, and it has to meet prescription labeling requirements, which means it also has to meet translation requirements. So, I think the idea is to make it as akin as possible to an in-person pharmacy transaction. And that concludes the principles.
Oh, one thing, Josh, on the fees portion, I want to make sure that it applies to the ADDS and not the AUDS.
Currently, the fee applies to all types of ADDSs, so it would include AUDSs. There would be a fee per AUDS to license it, because that's to cover the board's costs of licensing that. So the fee would be $200 per, or up to $250 per device.
Not for a hospital.
Right, except for hospitals don't have to do that.
This will be
obviously.
if there's a nursing home machine. Okay, the other thing, Stan, you may want to consider this as part of the licensing committee, is how will this impact the advanced practice tech? So there may be some options there as well.
Well, when I see, it speaks about pharmacy staff supplying the machines, I mean, you're right. I see that as being an opportunity for advanced pharmacy tech rather than a pharmacist.
Okay.
And, you know, getting just slightly, if I could just off of the point a bit, but combining, you know, worry about.
Dan, they can't hear you.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. When we worry about volume, when we're talking about rural pharmacies and 225 prescriptions, you know, if you look at a realistic solution, could be one of these machines doing the refills. I mean, this machine, I mean, if we take all that and add it together, then you have an environment that might be more realistic as far as achievable by, you know, 2 techs. So I think that this would be advantageous in rural areas. Yeah, thank you.
Anything else, Josh?
Nope.
Okay, so move forward. Any other public comment on this item? Yes, Danny.
One quick clarification question. Will these machines be housing controlled substances?
As currently drafted, yes.
Okay, on that, and I don't mean to belabor this point. Business and Professions Code 4075, no prescription for a controlled substance transmitted by means of an oral or electronically transmitted order shall be furnished to any person unknown and unable to properly establish his or her identity. So I mean, again, this is something that has been a big concern for CPHA on the ID requirements. I again would just ask that this would be part of this proposal.
Thank you. All right, agenda item 6, discussion and consideration of possible statutory proposal to require e-prescribing of prescription drugs. There's a summary in your packet of the history. The DEA final rule for electronic prescriptions for controlled substance, or EPCS, was published on March 31st, 2010, almost 8 years ago, and became effective that same year. Currently, there are 7 states that have passed legislation on e-prescribing. Laws already exist in 3 states, New York, Minnesota, and Maine, while the remaining 4 will become effective in 2018. Of the 3 states that have active laws, Minnesota requires prescribers, pharmacies, and health systems to have the capabilities to e-prescribe, but does not mandate its use. New York and Maine mandate the use of e-prescribing as the primary means of prescribing any medication. According to SureScripts data, 98% of retail pharmacies are able to accept e-prescriptions, and 45.3 million prescriptions for controlled substances were delivered electronically in 2016, which is a 256% increase from the 12.81 million controlled substances in 2015. In New York, which has had a mandate since March 2016 for both controlled and non-controlled prescriptions to be e-prescribed, 98% of the pharmacies were EPCS enabled, which is consistent with the SureScripts data, and 72% of prescribers were EPCS enabled. 1 year before, only 47% of New York prescribers could use EPS. So that's a dramatic improvement in 1 year. 92% of controlled substances were sent electronically, according to SureScript. The use of e-prescribing is increasing. A lot of it is just because of the electronic health records, meaningful use standards from CMS. It also reduces overall mistakes while interpreting prescribers' handwriting, and enables fast retrieval of records. And the DEA has in the published rules, there is a specific dual authentication requirement that's required in federal law to be able to use e-prescribing. So today for board discussion and consideration, at the December 2017 committee meeting, the Enforcement and Compounding Committee considered the proposal to require e-prescribing as a primary mode for ordering controlled substance and other prescription drugs in California. And in the Enforcement Committee, in the proposal, would need to allow for exemptions to the e-prescribing. So there's certain scenarios where that wouldn't be appropriate. So perhaps for terminally ill patients or when the electronic prescription is not available. I mean, I would also add for emergency department prescriptions, because I know New York has had an issue with that. Because when a patient is seen in the emergency department and needs their medication right then at night, and sometimes the prescribers don't know what pharmacies are open. And if that prescription gets sent to a pharmacy that's closed, it could be a problem for that patient. So I think the electronic prescribing for EDs is going to be important. So the Enforcement Committee had a motion to recommend that the board sponsor legislation for requiring e-prescribing, but allowing us for specific exemptions, including terminally ill exemptions, ER provisions, and that the staff work with the chair to identify other exemptions. California Hospital Association spoke in support of the proposal, but requested a phased-in approach over a period of time. Angie Minetti, representing California Retail, spoke in support of the proposal. Lori Wemsley, representing Walgreens, spoke in support. Ketan Patel, representing Kaiser, spoke in support, and CVS Health spoke in support of the proposal. So the text of the legislative proposal is being refined and will be distributed at the meeting, which has been distributed. So there's a copy of it.
And Josh can walk everybody through it if you'd like.
Josh?
This was
Sure.
a team effort this
Yes.
time.
So there's several preliminary questions that would need to be answered about approaching something like this. One of which is sort of a silly only lawyers care about this question, but it's where in the code would you put this kind of law, since it applies to not just pharmacies but prescribers. There's some things that are in the pharmacy law that are really more about prescribers, like what's a prescription and so forth, but it still seems to me it ought to go in a more general place than that. So I tried to put it in the intro sections to the Business Professions Code, the sub 100, which are definitional and sort of across license category kinds of provisions. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there are at least two different kinds of ways you could require someone to do e-prescribing or require prescribers to do it. You could require them to be able to do it, but not actually require that they do it. Or you could go straight to requiring that they do it, which necessarily incorporates the capability piece. So not knowing what the board's preference was, we kind of wrote it both ways, or wrote it in a staggered way to do both. So the first two provisions, A and B, require that by January 1st, 2020, prescribers have the ability to transmit and pharmacies have the ability to receive prescriptions for both non-controlled and controlled drugs. So that would be, 2.5 years a rollout period, essentially, to, I guess, 1.5 years at this point, to by the time this becomes law. But I mean, by the time this becomes law, that they would have that time to get ready, purchase whatever hardware and software might be necessary. And then additionally, the year subsequent, January 1st, 2021, is where the law would actually start requiring that prescriptions be transmitted and received in electronic transmission form. So there's two different time deadlines. First to be ready, and then to actually do it. And then the actually do it part has the exceptions that the board, that Amy identified in her opening, which is that, for instance, terminally ill patients is in there, emergency, technological glitches, things like that are built in to say that there are certain trapdoors that allow you to not do it electronically. But other than the application of those trapdoors, by January 1st, 2021, all prescribing would have to be done and received electronically.
The issue is that, God, I forgot what I was gonna say. Go ahead, counsel. Please, go right ahead,
Oh, good,
since
yeah,
I've
yeah. An
obviously
opportunity
forgotten it.
to give it some. So it seems that over the years, we've had times where we've had collaborative moments with the medical board, and there have been times when we haven't enjoyed the same success of collaboration. How can we? I mean, is this something that we would want to collaborate with the medical board? I mean, it seems to me that, you know, more than expecting physicians to electronically prescribe, demanding that they do, it would be an opportunity for us, hopefully, to have a positive collaborative relationship. I agree with you.
I think we want to collaborate with all of the prescribing boards. The veterinarians are excluded in this draft only because they seem to be excluded literally everywhere from having to do e-prescribing in most states. In most states that have e-prescribing requirements, there are approximately 10 exceptions to when it doesn't apply. One of it, maybe the patient gets to the pharmacy or the patient wants it to go to a different pharmacy. You should allow the patient to allow that pharmacy to transfer it to the pharmacy of the patient's choice for whatever reason. Maybe something changed and the patient can't get to it.
I don't think the DA allows that for C2s.
Well, they don't, but that's something we can maybe take up with the DEA, and with this far out, this is something we can take with. But yeah, they don't, if you haven't filled it, they don't want it just transferred. So, but again, keep in mind, most states now are moving in the direction of requiring e-prescribing, in part because of the advantages to prevent mid-errors and other things, but principally because it's a more secure method of preventing getting these controlled substances out into the wrong hands. And so,
Yeah, it appears though that we're impacting another profession's practice. I kind of agree with Stan that we really should be working with them. I mean, we'd want them to come in and tell us what to do on the dispensing side. So I think it's important that we collaborate and do this with them as well.
well, I've been invited to the medical board's meeting
Good.
for what it's worth.
Cheryl, do you have a comment?
No, I was just agreeing with what Jenny was referring to as being able to also, if someone goes to a pharmacy and it was a Schedule II and it's e-prescribed and for some reason they can't get it there, now this person's in pain and they can't go to another pharmacy, that's a problem.
And I don't believe, Josh, I haven't read the federal requirements. Will they let you transfer a C2 from one pharmacy to another under the DEA federal
They
requirements?
don't allow any transfers of electronic controlled
Period.
substance prescriptions. I think the reason for that being that you can't establish the same handshake security that you do with the initial transmission when you make a transfer. So
I actually, at the NABP meeting, Josh, I talked to the DA rep there. They said that if you're in a system and you do have, you haven't touched it yet, so it's like sitting in a queue. Let's say that you own 10 pharmacies, another pharmacy can forward it. It's not a transfer, but it's a forwarding before it's filled.
right, and that's what they say now, but it always makes me uncomfortable to rely on individual guidance, things like that from DEA.
Put it in writing. I'll find it.
Okay.
I'd like to know about that because I actually ended up having a problem with a prescription like that. I was in a lot of pain.
So we have an author for this particular bill that came to us and is ready to do it.
So what do you need from us?
We need a motion to move forward with a provision on e-prescribing, recognizing that despite what's here, we're going to have to probably accept amendments as it moves through the process. But the goal is to ensure a more secure, safer system for e-prescribing and help prevent substance abuse in the process.
So moved.
I second.
Amy, before we do that, there are also times that when the physician is out of the office, they need to phone in the prescription for the patient. So do you have any exemptions that allow this, that the prescriber is known to the pharmacist don't know the prescriber, that they could phone in the prescription?
Well, if you've got a phone, you can probably e-prescribe. If
That I
just-
don't know.
Well,
No, you
Th-
need,
there's no
not
specific
necessarily because you
wording.
need two-token authentication usually.
But part of that, though, I think that's where they're going long-term, so.
And the after hours, that physician out of the office, but they know the patient and they want to phone in the prescription. Also the
We
weekends.
we're not
We're not
prohibiting.
gonna,
So
we're not gonna
sorry.
prohibit phoning
No.
with us. I think it's just the written ones is what it is, Victor.
We want them to go to e-prescribing as much as possible,
Yes,
but there
as
will
much,
be a
but
list
I-
of exemptions.
I want to see this exemption exists for certain
Okay.
situations.
Okay, and that's what part of the process is, and I think that's part of the engagement with the other prescribing boards too. They may have additional concerns.
Albert?
You know, the money incentive is the most effective way. I think Medicare's require the prescriber to e-prescribe, otherwise they're gonna have lower reimbursement rate. So that's why you have such a high, subscriber doing e-prescribing right now.
Right, but that has not, there's been, since 2009, those incentives were in place. I think they first took effect in 2011 as positive incentives, and then after 2013, I think were negative incentives. And it hasn't yet led to the kind of widespread adoption that the board had hoped would be brought by those incentives.
Any public comment?
Good morning, Lori Walmsley on behalf of Walgreens. Again, I just would like to reiterate our support of this proposed legislation. A couple of comments regarding the draft proposal here. I noticed that the new draft only includes controlled substances. I believe that your conversation at the Compounding and Enforcement Committee, you were potentially discussing all prescriptions, which we would be in support of. That's similar to what they have in New York and has provided some very good successes there. One other suggestion for an addition to the draft language would be including some sort of enforcement penalties for prescribers that do not comply. That's another one of the reasons why New York has been so successful with their efforts, is because they do have enforcement penalties built into their current regulations.
There's actually a provision in the bill.
Hey, Jenny, you need to use your microphone.
I've got two of them in front of me and I'm still not using them. And like you, I've never been told I can't be heard. We have provisions for the pharmacy that fails to be equipped to accept e-prescriptions, and there's a consequence to the prescriber that fails to be ready by 2020.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, both of those, I just respond to both those comments. It was not our intention in this language to limit it to controlled substances. All it says is that where you are doing it by controlled substances, those have to comply with the DEA regulations, but the language is more general than that.
I think my confusion is in C. A prescription for a controlled substance shall be issued as an electronic database prescription. Specifically
Okay.
states controlled substance there.
Okay, well, that was the part that Jenny wrote, so that's her fault.
It was what I wrote. And while we're sharing blame, it was this one.
No, I think, and what does the board think? I mean, should we expend this? But I think we have a leg to stand on the controlled substance side. Do we want to say that every single prescription that's written should be controlled?
Well, I mean,
Should be e-prescribed?
yeah, you're saying, I guess I just want to say one thing preliminary to that, which is that you are already saying in this draft, by 2020, they have to have the capability to do both.
Yes.
Do you want to require them to actually do both with regard to all drugs, or only with regard to controlled substances? Sorry, that's what I wanted.
With everything? We can certainly change it.
Well, while I think it's a good idea, I think getting it through is our primary purpose with controlled drugs. I think they'll do it. If they're going to do it with controlled drugs, I think they'll just naturally.
If they have the capability and they're going to send a Vicodin prescription, why not send the Benazepril with it? But I think it's just going to be a lot harder to get this through for everything. That's just my perception.
Well, to me, I've watched.
Stand
To
microphone.
me, I've watched physicians evolve, and I've watched physicians that were resistant actually retire. When the computer came along and the computerized medical record and everything, I saw actually physicians retire.
Stan, in my In my world, when I'm not the Board of Pharmacy President, my other role, we've got almost over 90% electronic prescribing, and all our physicians do it. To me, it's like a no-brainer. I'm just looking at the way that we can get this through, because I think it's a lot harder to tell someone everything. I think they're going to do both, just because the functionality is there. But do we really want to take on that big battle now?
Well, I don't, again, I mean, it's certainly worth pursuing, and we could get, you know, a sense about, you know, how they feel from the regulatory boards that we speak to. But I have watched physicians now that can go to computerized medical records. I mean, they are always complaining that they're doing so much on the computer.
Well, I was surprised because I actually, because of my perception and the fact that I've got over 90%, I actually asked Debbie, and I'll put Debbie on the spot, and I said, from CVS's perspective, what percentage of your prescriptions in California are e-prescribed? I think you said like 50 or some percent. I think she said it was lower. It was a lower number than 100. It was way lower than 90%. So I was surprised. And I just, not that she's speaking on behalf of them, I'm just trying to get a real world feel for what this was. I don't know, you guys, Victor and Albert, what is your percentage of e-prescribing?
Oh, mine's only like 30%.
Yeah.
We still have a lot of physicians handwrite prescriptions or oral prescriptions.
Ours is quite high. I would say 70 to 80%.
Yeah, I think what Amy is not saying, but I'll go ahead and say it, is that there's likely to be resistance from CMA, and it's hard to get things passed that CMA resists. So, but whether the negotiation strategy is to, you know, ask for everything and then settle for half of it, or what, is the board's decision. My personal view would be that we should make it for everything and then have it be pared back to controlled substances if that's what happens.
May be surprised.
May I make one additional comment, Madam President? From a patient safety perspective, I really truly believe that there is value in including all prescriptions. I understand that there may be opposition from the other medical colleagues, but there is a lot of benefits outside of just the controlled substance diversion situation that I think need to be considered from a patient safety perspective, especially when you're talking about it from a board.
So my only concern, we actually, in the long-term care world, we actually encourage all of our physicians to do their scheduled drugs that way because it eliminates a lot of hassle. The problem I do have that if we make it for all prescriptions, because now we're talking about a patient being discharged from a hospital to a nursing home and they may not get the prescriptions in time because the doctor that's discharging is not the doctor that is following the patient. So if we tried to make all drugs electronically transferred, it wouldn't work from the nursing home perspective.
So the doctor discharging is not.
In most cases, the doctor discharging is not the following physician at the facility.
Doesn't the patient come with discharge meds from the facility?
No.
Or discharge orders?
They come with discharge orders, and we can't fill the scheduled drugs with those discharge orders. I mean, there is a weird way you can do it if everything's written on the prescription, the doctor signs it. But on the controlled drugs, we require a e-scribe. I mean, we encourage the physicians to do that. So they're willing to do that. If we call physicians, hey, there's just been a patient admitted that's going to be under your name, and they have the following 10 drugs, or they have the following controlled drugs, e-prescribed. They can e-prescribe. But they're not going to sit down there and e-prescribe the other 10 drugs. You know, the ferrous sulfate, the, you know, whatever. It's that will hinder everybody. But the scheduled drugs, for sure, 100%.
Thank you. So what's the board's, does anyone want to make a motion? How's that? And, but was Stan and Cheryl, was that for all prescriptions? Let's clarify it.
No, I was going for,
it was
I
kind
take
of
mine back, not for all prescriptions.
Motion that we just pursue it.
Okay.
And not necessarily limit it right now.
Okay. So not limit it?
You should vote on the language that's in front of you, though, or at least, you know, the general concepts in front of you, at least. Give the staff some direction.
So I think that's though an important, what Josh was saying is an important strategy. Are we going to ask for everything and then pare down? Or are we just going to say controlled substances and hope that they'll go with everything?
I was in agreement with controlled substance, so someone else can second.
I would say the contrary. I'm sorry, Cheryl.
That's okay.
Okay, so your motion stands.
My motion would be that we follow this draft, only we follow it with all prescribing, with the exemptions mentioned.
Second?
I'll second that.
Okay. Debbie, second. Any board member comments before we do public comment? Public comment.
Hi, I own a pharmacy and I use Comcast Internet. Comcast Internet is not reliable. Has been down for me so many times, so I have to call the provider to get available prescriptions. If you require us to have all prescriptions by e-prescriptions, it's very, very hard to comply.
Well,
For
there's
the
already an exemption
situation.
written for electronic failure.
Yeah, but don't make it like 100%. Just like the provider have also the choice to, in case like this, so we don't have to go back and look. Do we qualify for this exemption or not? It's just very time consuming.
I think
We
what
have to
council was
catch up.
saying is that there will be an exemption for an electronic failure. So if there is an electronic failure, then they can use a paper prescription.
Well, to me, as a patient, I mean, if I have a prescription and I'm on my way to Rite Aid, no, I want to go to CVS, I no longer have that option, right?
You'd have the option with this. Unless it's a controlled, then there's a potential problem because the DEA won't let you transfer the controlled substances.
Right. There's no problem with transferring non-controlled electronic prescriptions.
Well, but I think isn't one of the exceptions, we don't want the pharmacy to become the police officer of e-prescribing. So if a patient comes walking in with a paper prescription, wouldn't the pharmacy be able to assume that an exemption has been met? We don't really want them to have to go through the rule book and verify that the exemption has been met.
Unless it's a forgery.
Some states,
Well, if it's a
some
forgery, if
states
it-
have that as a law, but I think the marketplace can probably straighten that out. If either, the question is are we going to require e-prescribing generally? And
generally, yes.
Then one of the exceptions has got to be when a paper prescription would be appropriate. And so in a case where a prescriber just prefers paper, that would not probably be compliant. But if the patient wants it because I'm not sure what pharmacy I'm going to go to and I want the prescription in hand, maybe that would be a reason. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't want a patient to come in with a paper prescription and have pharmacies like deny them or cause a problem. I mean, I'm all for e-prescribing and e-prescribing on all drugs. I just think we need to make sure that we're reasonable about our exceptions and we don't make the pharmacy get stuck in the middle.
As sure as I'm sitting in this chair, given that every other state has a number of exemptions where they've done the law, my guess is that those kinds of exceptions, although I haven't seen one quite as broad as the one you just described.
So I need to know what pharmacy I want to fill it at the time, immediately.
Or I think what Jenny said is maybe if the patient requests, I want a paper prescription, that might be one of the exceptions.
The other alternative is maybe it goes back to the prescriber, they have to cancel the prior prescription if it's an e-prescription and send it to our
Microphone.
If perhaps that the patient changes her mind about what pharmacy it should go to. I'm not going to Rite Aid, I want to go to CVS, and this is a CVS I want to go to, the prescriber may have to cancel the prior prescription and then take it to, in the case of a control.
So Cheryl, I had an example where I actually had gone and gotten a prescription for antibiotics, and then I went to the pharmacy and they said, it was e-prescribed. It's no longer we're not your PBM provider anymore, but the pharmacy down the street is. So they just told me to go there and they transferred my prescription without a problem.
And this would be allowed. That would be allowed in this draft.
Yeah.
It's just the controlled substances quirk.
And it was a different pharmacy. It wasn't like it was part of the same chain, but they were able to do it.
Take that from the patient. I can go where I want to get
But Josh, this is going to be a few years down the road. So isn't there a way you still could appeal to DEA to change that ruling on Schedule 2? I mean,
You mean me personally? Yeah. I'll make that happen.
I will commit to pursuing that because I think it's in the patient's interest. There's got to be some other way to track it.
But if you look at New York and the strides that they made in a relatively short period of time, It's actually, it's actually shocking.
Yeah, it is.
And so, and here we are, this is 2016. Here we are 2 years later.
5 years by the time this kicks in.
But, and yeah, but today, I mean, you know, physicians and practitioners are all the more computer comfortable. And by the time it's fully kicked in, you know, it's hard to believe that anybody will be using paper.
And it will be on their phones.
I agree with Stan. I think right now you have few those old-time prescriber resisting this e-prescribing. But like you say, a few years down the line, I think the market will dictate itself. Everybody will be e-prescribing. But also on the control prescription e-prescribing, it could be very problematic because I have a prescription the other day that it was e-prescribed to me for a patient that haven't been here a long time, and it was some controlled substance, Schedule 2, and I don't feel comfortable filling it, and I say I refuse it, so we have to call the office again and have the doctor call into or e-prescribe to another pharmacy. So we're gonna get a lot of prescriber mad. You're gonna make them do a lot of extra work, and at the same time you deny the patient's medication.
Jenny, I mean, pursuant to Stan's comment, can we find out from the New York Board of Pharmacy whether this has done in terms of diversion potential in New York?
I can tell you, Dr. Shoppers, they told me by the full rollout, which was 1 year past that, 90% drop in Dr. Shoppers. 90%. It just literally stopped it because the validation was already there. And it stops people going online, buying buying prescriptions and then submitting it and they look real. Like I said, they don't steal prescription pads from prescribers anymore. They just go online and buy them.
Hi, Lori Walmsley on behalf of Walgreens again. One suggestion, I would suggest that you guys both mentioned New York and learning from them. I know they've added a lot of different exclusions, so I would suggest maybe reaching out to them and finding out what they've done, because I'm not hearing a lot of issues from our stores in the state of New York with regards to customer service delays or those types of things. So I think they've done a pretty good job in including a lot of those different restrictions. And I think to Josh's recommendation, I would again recommend that you guys start with all prescriptions, and then you could always work down to controlled substances if you received a lot of pushback as a consolation.
Well,
And Lori,
that's the
didn't
current motion.
Lori, didn't New York start out with at one point they had like a lot of exceptions and then they modified them, or
They terminate at particular times. They put an exception in to help get everyone up to speed, and then they started pulling them back. New York was actually the first state I talked to because of their Dr. Shopper thing.
And I've spoken with local folks in both New York and in Virginia where these are
Virginia just did it.
currently implemented, and we haven't seen a lot of issues in our stores since this has been required.
California used to be in the top 10 for e-prescribing. We're now down to number 16 because so many states have been mandated to do e-prescribing. This is no longer innovative, really. It's kind of like we're at the tail of the end of the dog.
Thank you.
we used to be in the head.
We used to be on the head part. We're getting less attractive.
I feel like we're at some kind of old time music. All these names are like the tail end, old time prescribers, like some of that old time.
Oh, it's colloquial day at the Board of Pharmacy.
Okay, so we have a motion. Now, did we get let's get a second for Stan's motion. Oh, you were. Okay.
It's
Debbie. Okay, all in favor, raise your hand, please. Opposed? Opposition. Okay.
Well, amendments are going to have to be taken.
The only thing I ask is let's make sure we really partner with the medical board.
Yep, will do.
So now is this enforcement that does this, that will work on this?
Yes. Okay, moving on to the next agenda item, which, I'm sorry, Laura?
Yeah, before you do that, I'd actually recommend that the board go back to the prior agenda item. you reviewed all the terms of the potential legislation. that
Are we
you
talking about the
add-
automated
ads,
dispensing? Okay.
yeah, the automated dispensing, and you reviewed. Josh went over all the sort of the proposals that were there, and left unsaid was that that staff would be able to go seek an author and work on draft language.
I thought we voted
consistent
on
with
that.
You did a one motion about whether or not you wanted to pursue legislation at all, and then you talked about the
Okay, so let's
specifics of
do
the
a
legislation
follow-up
that you
motion
do a
regarding the items that Josh presented. Is there a motion on the table?
To review, just to.
To find an author and have the staff draft something with the concepts that Josh outlined.
Which are also outlined under the general requirements in the board's packet under agenda item 5.
Right, and I think the only place that you deviated from what's in the board's packet was with regard to the 5 limitations on the.
Right, we're going to come back with language. Either it can be between 1 and 5, or we'll have language saying a maximum of 5, but a lower number could be set by board regulation. Those will be 2 different possibilities.
And that's actually what triggered my question, which is because do you want that conversation to happen before staff starts looking for authors?
I mean, I think that's a great compromise, is to have it maximum of 5, but the regulations can actually lower that. I think that's a really good, what do you guys think as a compromise?
I think that's a good compromise because I'm still not convinced that 5 is the right number. I feel like we're just grabbing a number, so I'm not sure why we're saying a lower number. How about, could we say a change in the number could occur by legislation? Because maybe we'll want to increase it. I don't know. I don't really have no clue.
And I think it should be lower.
Yeah.
So
Laura?
Well, you could do it either way. So you could pursue it with 2 and allow the board to modify that by regulation.
Can we just say that the board regulation will designate the number and not even list a number?
Sure.
Why?
Yeah, the board.
The regs are taking at least a year now to get through.
Yeah, that will mean that the legislation can't go into effect until the board does the regulations. So that would build in an automatic delay of a year for actual effect of the
I'm
legislation.
okay with the 5. I just was not okay with the, or the board could lower the number. I just think it should be, or the board could change the number by regulation.
Okay. Is the rest of the board members okay with that? 5 or is changed by the board?
So I'll if that's okay, then I'll make that motion if someone wants to second that.
So your motion is all provisions that are listed in the agenda item number 5, with the modification that instead of just saying limit the number of APDS units to 5, it will say limit the number of APDS units to 5 or to some number set by the board.
Right.
By a reg. Got it.
Second? Stan? Ricardo, did I hear a second?
Wasn't there also something about getting an author?
Ricardo going to second?
Ricardo-
Okay. So motion by Debbie, second by Ricardo. Okay, any public comment? All in favor? Opposed? 5-3, okay.
Okay.
All right, can we move on to the next one?
Thank you.
All right, discussion and, excuse me, discussion and consideration of possible statutory proposal to reconcile federal and state control schedules. So at the November board meeting, the board discussed the possibility of finding a means to address the differences in federal and state controlled substances so that the more restrictive provision would prevail. Staff was directed to work on the concept and bring the proposed legislation back to the board for review and discussion, and the proposal is in your packet. Do you want to go over it, Jenny?
Just for a point, I think
We
we skipped
skipped
7.
Yeah, you skipped 7 and went to 8, but I don't. You can do 7
we can
first.
go back to 7.
Yeah, I can go back to 7 if
Yeah,
you
we
want.
can go back to 7. Let's just finish with this one.
So it's pretty self-explanatory, but basically the idea is that the definition of controlled substance, both in the Business and Professions Code and the Health and Safety Code, would be expanded and clarified that that can include state or federal, and whichever is more stringent would prevail.
It's simple. Josh did a nice job.
So what do you need, just a motion to approve?
Please.
Victor, move. Second?
I second.
Second, Cheryl. Any public comment? All board members in favor, raise your hand. Unanimous, great.
I'm glad we held 7 out because it's going to be really controversial.
Going back to item 7, discussion and consideration of allowing continuing education credit for the board's pharmacy law update course. December 6, 2017, the executive officer provided a presentation here at California North State University School of Pharmacy covering 2018 laws that were new and was attended by approximately 30 licensees. The executive officer is requesting that the board approve 1.5 hours of CE for the attendees. Is there a motion?
I was gonna say, we have a we have a testimonial that can be given by
was there?
Mr. Shad.
Were you there?
I was here. It was phenomenal, and I think I should get 15 units rather than 1.5 for.
Not the least bit self-serving.
So I heard a motion to my right.
Oh my God, yes.
Victor,
Actually,
okay,
so-
second.
You're gonna laugh at me about this, but since you did participate, I would actually recommend that you not participate.
No,
in
that's
the
I.
vote.
Both
Abstain.
attorneys
I
are
was
nodding their
doing.
heads.
I was doing that very nicely, Laura. Victor took the motion.
I think
Okay,
you're
thank
losing
you.
the 15 units too, Alan.
Are you doing the "Don't let Grandpa Alan know that you're ignoring him" thing?
Second.
Can we have a motion, please?
We did. Victor made a motion
Victor,
to
sorry.
approve. Second, Albert.
Thank you.
Okay, all in favor?
No.
I forgot
You're
the
an
public.
abstain.
Was there any
You're gonna be
public
the
comment on this?
abstain.
I apologize. Okay.
I don't know. Do we need to take his hours away?
No.
I'm so sorry.
I'm not going to karaoke with you.
So you did all in favor. I think you need to finish it just because I think we need to record the abstention for the record. Did you?
Oh,
I heard
okay.
all in favor.
You're right. All in favor. Any against?
Against?
Were you? Did you vote in favor? No. Okay. Well, this is any against. So against the motion. Abstention. 1. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh my God.
I know. I thought he was going to do this. Okay. So we are now at closed session. So we will move into closed session. Do we need to announce any cases?
Yeah, let me
Laura?
give you the. case
Please do so.
number.